Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I always considered myself a pretty experienced camper. I'd grown up around the woods, went on every scouting trip, knew how to handle myself out there. That's why, last fall, I didn't think twice when my friend Tom suggested a weekend camping trip. He'd found this spot, an isolated patch of forest by a small lake, miles away from any other campsite. Sounded perfect. No cell service, no people, just us and nature. We arrived late on Friday just as the sun was dipping below the trees. The drive was longer than expected, the dirt roads winding and full of potholes. Tom swore this place would be worth it, though, and when we finally stepped out of the truck, I had to admit he was right. The lake was crystal clear, reflecting the pink and orange hues of the sunset, and the towering pine trees surrounding us made it feel like we were in another world. We set up camp quickly, pitching our tent close to the shore and starting a fire. By the time we were done, it was dark. The stars above were bright, and the woods around us were still. We made dinner, told stories, and by midnight we were feeling good, the kind of relaxation that only a campfire and a couple of beers can bring. It was around then that we first heard it, a faint rustling coming from the trees just beyond the light of our fire. We both went quiet, staring into the darkness. Probably just a deer, I thought. Or maybe a raccoon sniffing around for food. "You hear that?" Tom asked, his voice low. "Yeah, probably just an animal," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But something about the way those branches snapped, loud and deliberate, made my skin crawl. We shined our flashlights into the forest, but all we saw were shadows and the glimmer of leaves. Eventually the sound stopped, and we went back to our conversation, though the mood had shifted. The silence was heavier, like the woods were listening in. It was around 2 a.m. when we decided to call it a night. We put out the fire and crawled into the tent, zipping ourselves in. The forest was silent now, and soon the exhaustion of the day hit, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke up a few hours later, my heart racing, and I didn't know why. I lay still, listening to the sound of my own breathing and the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. And then I heard it again, that rustling coming from the woods. But this time, it was closer, much closer. I nudged Tom, who groaned and turned over. "Shh! Listen," I whispered. The rustling grew louder, closer, as if something, or someone, was circling the tent. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking, and flicked it on. The light pierced through the fabric of the tent, casting strange, distorted shadows. We stayed like that, silent and staring, listening to that movement outside. And then we heard it, a low, slow breathing, deep breaths in and out, right on the other side of the tent wall. Tom sat up, wide-eyed, and mouthed, "What the hell is that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what could make that noise. Bear? Too slow. Human? Maybe. But it sounded wrong. And then, all at once, the breathing stopped. We sat there in that silence for what felt like hours, straining our ears for any sound. Finally, after what felt like forever, Tom muttered, "I'm going out there." Before I could stop him, he unzipped the tent, and the cool night air rushed in. He poked his head out, shining the flashlight in every direction. "There's nothing," he started to say, but then froze, his light catching something just beyond the trees. I leaned over, trying to see what he was looking at, and then I saw it. A figure, standing about 50 feet away, half hidden by the trees. At first I thought it was a person, but it was wrong. It was tall, too tall to be a human, and thin, almost skeletal, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. It was pale, like moonlight reflecting on a corpse, and its head was all wrong. I couldn't see its face clearly, but there was something about the way it tilted, staring right back at us, that made my blood run cold. Tom didn't move, and neither did I. We were frozen, locked in a staring match with this thing, whatever it was. And then, slowly, it began to move. It didn't walk exactly. It kind of glided, like its feet never touched the ground, weaving between the trees with a strange, almost hypnotic grace. "Get back in the tent," I hissed, grabbing Tom's arm and pulling him inside. We zipped it shut and turned off the flashlight, plunging ourselves into darkness, hoping, praying, that if we stayed quiet enough it would leave us alone. For the next hour we sat in total silence, our ears straining for any sound. The forest was eerily still, no wind, no birds, no insects, nothing. Eventually we started to think that maybe, whatever it was, it had left. That's when we heard the footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate, circling the tent, and then came a sound I will never forget. A voice, or something like a voice, right outside. It spoke in a low, gravelly whisper, repeating a word over and over. At first I couldn't make it out, but as it got closer I realized what it was saying. "Help. Me. Help. Me." The voice sounded like a woman's, but distorted, like a recording played backward and slowed down. It sent shivers down my spine. Tom's eyes were wide, his face pale in the darkness. Do we open the tent?" he whispered, and I could see the terror in his eyes. "No," I said, grabbing his arm tight. "No, we wait. We wait until it's gone." The voice circled us, sometimes close, sometimes far, always whispering that same haunting plea. And then, just like that, it stopped. The footsteps faded away and we were left in silence once again. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We just sat there, clutching our flashlight and knife, praying for dawn. And when the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the tent, we wasted no time packing up and getting the hell out of there. As we drove away, I looked back at the campsite one last time. The forest was calm, peaceful, like nothing had happened. But as we rounded the corner of the lake, I saw it. A figure standing at the tree line, pale and thin, watching us go. We never talked about that night again. Tom refuses to go camping, and I don't blame him. But sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I can still hear it. That voice, whispering from the darkness. "Help. Me." And I wonder what would have happened if we'd opened that tent. I'm a park ranger stationed at a remote outpost in the northern stretches of the Appalachian Mountains. The forest here is dense, ancient, and unsettling. On a good day, it's beautiful. Wild flowers swaying in the cool breeze, birds chirping above the rustle of leaves, the faint scent of pine hanging in the air. But when the sun dips behind the ridges and the shadows grow long, the woods transform into something else entirely. That night started like any other. I was alone in the ranger's cabin, my only company a cup of strong coffee and the crackling of a fire that barely cut through the creeping chill. Outside, the wind howled, making the trees groan like old bones. The radio, usually full of chatter from other rangers or the occasional camper, had been dead silent for hours. It wasn't unusual this far out. Sometimes signals just didn't get through, but something about the quiet unnerved me. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. After all, I'd been here for nearly 3 years and had gotten used to the solitude. But that night, there was something different. It was subtle at first, a strange sound from outside, like twigs snapping but closer, deliberate. Not the random noise of a forest, but something moving. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The air was thick with mist, swirling between the trees like smoke. The beam of my light barely pierced the fog. For a moment I listened. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie absolute silence, and then I heard it. A low growl, so faint I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. But it was there, just beyond the reach of my light. My hand instinctively went to the radio at my belt, but I stopped. I didn't know what I'd say, and besides, I was probably just spooking myself. I took a step forward, boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together like fingers clawing at the sky. Something moved in the corner of my eye. Just a shadow, I told myself. But when I turned the light, there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The fog seemed to thicken, closing in around me. I was about to turn back when I heard another sound. A whispering, almost like words carried on the wind. I froze, heart pounding. It didn't make sense. No one else should be out here, not this deep into the forest, not at this time of night. Help! The voice was faint, barely audible, but I heard it. A woman's voice. My throat tightened. The first rule of the woods is never ignore a cry for help, no matter how unlikely. People get lost, turned around, and the forest can swallow them whole. But this voice, something about it felt wrong. Too soft, too distant, like it wasn't coming from any one direction. Help me! Against every instinct telling me to turn back, I followed the sound. The trees thickened as I moved deeper into the forest, their branches closing in, twisting into unnatural shapes. My breath puffed in the cold air, the mist clinging to me like a second skin. Every step I took was followed by another noise behind me, footsteps. But when I stopped, they stopped. I spun around, shining my light into the woods. Nothing. Just the thick, oppressive fog. But the footsteps didn't belong to the forest. They belonged to someone, or something. Then I saw it, movement between the trees. A shadow darting from one trunk to the next, too fast for me to focus on. My heart raced as I quickened my pace, trying to catch up. The voice called again, closer this time. Please, help. I broke through a line of trees into a small clearing. In the center stood a woman, her back to me, her clothes torn and dirty, hair hanging in tangled clumps. Relief washed over me. She was real. She was here. I wasn't imagining it. "Ma'am," I called, rushing toward her. "Are you hurt? What happened?" She didn't move, didn't turn around. The air grew still, and an icy chill gripped my spine. Something was wrong. I slowed my steps, every instinct screaming at me to stop. But I was too close to turn back. And then she moved. Slowly, unnaturally, her head twisted around, far too far, until her eyes locked onto mine. They weren't human. They were black, completely black, with no whites, no pupils, just endless voids. Her mouth hung open in a twisted, unnatural grin, revealing too many teeth, sharp and gleaming in the pale moonlight. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no making sense of it. It was wrong, something out of a nightmare. Suddenly, the sound of growling surrounded me, low and guttural, like a pack of wolves closing in. But it wasn't wolves. I glanced around, frantically searching the darkness, and that's when I saw them. Figures moving between the trees, hunched, tall, their limbs too long, their eyes glowing red in the shadows. Dog-like faces with human-like features, dogmen. I had heard of them. Whispers among the other rangers, legends of creatures that roamed these forests, but I had never believed them, not until now. The woman creature's grin widened, and she let out a guttural, inhuman sound, a mix of laughter and a growl. Behind her, one of the dogmen stepped into the clearing, towering over her, its eyes locked onto me. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face, the cold air burning my lungs as I sprinted through the forest. The growls followed closer and closer, and I could hear the pounding of paws or feet behind me. They were hunting me, playing with me. I stumbled over a root and hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw them in the distance, silhouettes against the fog, tall, twisted figures moving on all fours but with an unnatural jerking gait. I heard the whispering again, the woman's voice blending with something deeper, darker. "You'll never leave. I forced myself to my feet and ran, adrenaline driving me forward, my body moving on instinct alone. The cabin wasn't far now. If I could just make it there, lock the door, radio for help. The footsteps behind me stopped. I slowed, panting, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then I saw it. Standing on the porch of the cabin was a figure. It was me, my own face staring back at me, my own eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't me. It couldn't be. The figure smiled, a cruel, twisted smile, the same as the woman in the clearing. A skinwalker. Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed about this forest shattered in that moment. The legends were real. The stories, the whispers, they were all warnings, and I had ignored them. The figure stepped toward me and I backed away, heart pounding, legs trembling. There was no escape. They had me. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was that voice, soft and mocking, echoing through the trees. Now you belong to the woods. And then silence. Camping wasn't my thing, but after weeks of my buddy Rob nagging about this legendary trail out in the middle of the Rockies, I gave in. It was supposed to be one of those real wilderness experiences, far from civilization, where no phone signal could reach and the stars stretched endlessly above your head. That part sounded all right, but everything else? Nah. Especially after the stories I'd heard about these woods. Cryptid stories, stuff about skinwalkers and creatures lurking in the trees. Of course, I told myself they were just stories. The drive-in was long, too long. Rob's Jeep rattled over uneven dirt roads, nothing but trees and mountains around us for miles. The moment we lost cell signal, a pit formed in my stomach. But Rob, in his excitement, missed my unease. Man, this place is going to be epic, he said, grinning as he sped up. There's a ranger station near the start of the trail. We can check in, grab a map, all that. A small, worn-down wooden structure marked the entrance to the trailhead. A park ranger stepped out as we pulled in. He looked off. His uniform was dirty, his face gaunt, but his eyes, those dark eyes locked on us with unsettling intensity. He barely said a word while Rob chatted, just grunted something about making sure we stay on the trail and get back before dark. I tried to laugh it off, but something in his voice lingered with me. The trail was rugged, leading us deep into the forest. The trees thickened, casting long shadows that stretched over the narrow path. The only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves. It felt too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. We set up camp by a small clearing as dusk crept in. I thought the isolation might ease up on me once the fire was going. It didn't. The fire flickered in the dark, casting long shadows over the trees that seemed to twist and shift when you weren't looking directly at them. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, just my nerves. The first night I woke to something outside the tent. At first I thought it was Rob snoring or moving around. But no, this was different. Something was pacing just beyond the firelight, crunching softly through the underbrush. I listened, frozen, as it circled our camp. Slow, deliberate steps. And then silence. I wanted to call out to Rob, but I couldn't move. All I could do was lie there, heart pounding, listening to the wind stir the branches. I must have drifted off because when I woke again it was morning. Rob was already up, oblivious, messing around with the campfire. "You hear that last night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Hear what?" I dropped it. Maybe I was overreacting, but things got worse that afternoon. We hiked further up the trail, deeper into the woods, aiming for a ridge that supposedly had a killer view. The higher we went, the more uneasy I felt. I started noticing things, trees with deep claw marks like something had been sharpening its nails, and strange, twisted piles of bones at the base of several trees. Deer? Maybe. But then we found a pile of feathers, ripped clean off some poor bird arranged in a spiral. Rob, this normal to you?" Rob just shrugged it off, cracking a dumb joke. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. From the corner of my eye, I kept catching glimpses of movement, shadows that shouldn't have been there darting between the trees. Every now and then I'd hear strange, distorted animal sounds, like a coyote, but wrong. It was stretched out, elongated, like it had been played backward. We reached the ridge just before dusk. The view wasn't worth it. A thick fog had rolled in, choking the landscape. No stars, no moon, just darkness. It made everything feel claustrophobic. I wanted to head back to camp, but Rob insisted we stay and watch the sunset, what little there was of it. That's when we saw them, silhouettes moving through the fog. At first I thought it was just hikers, but there was something wrong with the way they moved. Jerky, unnatural, their limbs contorting at odd angles. They were too tall, too thin. They didn't walk. They seemed to glide. "Rob, we need to go. Now." He laughed it off, but when the figure stopped all at once and turned toward us, I saw his smile fade. The silence was deafening. We didn't even speak as we grabbed our gear and bolted back down the trail. I swear I could hear footsteps behind us echoing ours, close, too close. We barely made it back to camp before dark. My lungs burned and Rob kept glancing over his shoulder, eyes wide. The fire was out. No smoke, no embers, just cold ash, like it had been dead for hours. We sat there in the dark, too freaked out to talk. Rob kept looking at the woods, and I swore I could see shapes moving between the trees again, just out of sight. Then the voice came. It was Rob's voice, but it wasn't coming from him. It was coming from the trees. "Hey, over here!" it called out, mimicking his tone exactly. But Rob was sitting right next to me, pale as a ghost. We both froze. The voice called out again, closer this time. "Come on, follow me." That's when the smell hit, rotting meat, sour and thick, filling the air. I gagged. Rob stood up, looking around wildly. "Dude, we need to go back to the ranger station." But when we tried to pack, something stepped into the clearing. It looked like a man, but it wasn't. Its limbs were too long, its face blank except for dark, hollow eyes. And the smell, it was coming from it. "Stay on the trail," it rasped in that same distorted voice, now impossibly deep. "Stay. On the trail." I didn't think. I just grabbed Rob and ran. The thing followed, its footsteps matching ours, gaining. My heart pounded in my throat, fear overtaking any sense of direction. We ran through the trees, branches whipping at us, the stench growing stronger. And then suddenly the ranger station appeared ahead of us like a beacon of safety. We burst inside, slamming the door behind us, breathing hard. The ranger was there, sitting at his desk, calm, too calm. "We need help," Rob gasped, barely able to speak. "There's something out there." The ranger just looked at us, those same dark eyes as before, but now I realized what was wrong with them. They weren't human. They were empty, lifeless. "You didn't stay on the trail," he said in that same deep voice. And behind him, stepping out of the shadows, were more of those things. Tall, thin figures with twisted limbs and hollow eyes, grinning. The door clicked shut behind us. "We're here to take you back to the woods," the ranger whispered, his voice stretching, breaking. "The rangers will come for you." Then darkness. I never believed in the stories, the ones about the woods near my hometown. I'd heard the legends growing up, tales of strange creatures and lost souls that lurked between the trees, but they were always just that, stories. Local folklore, passed down through generations to scare kids from wandering too far into the forest. I thought they were harmless, just ghost tales to spice up campfires. That all changed last fall. It was supposed to be a quick overnight camping trip. Just me, my buddy Tom, and a couple of beers by the fire. We'd done it before. Nothing special. The trail we took was one that people rarely used anymore, leading deep into the heart of the forest. We wanted solitude, and we got it. By the time we set up camp, the sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long, thin shadows across the clearing. The forest seemed unnaturally still. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just quiet. I tried not to let it bother me, but there was something about the way the silence hung in the air that felt wrong. Tom didn't seem to notice, though. He was cracking jokes, making light of the isolation. As night fell, the fire crackled and popped, casting a warm glow around our little camp. Tom and I sat there laughing and swapping stories, trying to ignore the way the woods seemed to close in around us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often I'd catch myself glancing into the trees, half expecting to see someone or something standing there, hidden in the darkness. Around midnight, Tom decided to take a walk. He said he wanted to stretch his legs, maybe take a piss, and would be back in a few minutes. I didn't think much of it at the time. I stayed by the fire, feeding it more wood, letting the warmth chase away the chill that was creeping into my bones. Minutes passed, then 20, then 30. Tom hadn't come back, and I stood up, grabbing the flashlight from my pack, and called out his name. No answer. Just the wind stirring through the branches overhead, whispering like a voice I couldn't quite make out. A knot of unease formed in my stomach as I shined the light into the forest, illuminating nothing but trees and darkness. I called for him again, louder this time, my voice echoing through the night. Still nothing. My heart started to pound. Tom wasn't the type to wander off without a word, especially not in the middle of the night in unfamiliar woods. I stepped toward the edge of the clearing, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The beam danced over the undergrowth, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched like they were alive. "Tom!" I shouted, my voice breaking the oppressive silence. And then I heard it. A voice, faint, almost muffled, coming from deep within the forest. "Help me." It was Tom's voice, weak and shaky, like he was hurt. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't just leave him out there. He needed me. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I took a step into the trees, shining the flashlight ahead of me. "Tom?" I called again, my voice shaking. "Where are you? Help me." The voice came again, closer now, but wrong. It sounded like Tom, but not quite right, like someone was imitating him. A chill ran down my spine. The stories, the legends, they rushed back into my mind, flooding me with a dread I couldn't explain. But I kept moving, pushing deeper into the woods. The underbrush was thick, the branches clawing at my clothes as I stumbled forward. The further I went, the colder it got. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me like a weight, making it hard to breathe. "Tom!" I shouted again, my voice cracking. "Here!" His voice responded, barely a whisper now, so close I should have been able to see him. I swung the flashlight around frantically, the beam cutting through the darkness in wild arcs. And then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. At first I thought it was Tom. He was standing there still and silent, his face hidden in shadow. Relief washed over me, and I started toward him, but something stopped me dead in my tracks. He wasn't moving. "Tom?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't respond, didn't even blink. I took a step closer, the flashlight shaking in my hand as the beam fell on his face. My breath caught in my throat. It looked like Tom, same clothes, same face, but there was something horribly wrong with him. His eyes were wide, too wide, staring at me with a vacant, dead expression. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. Just that blank, empty stare. "Help me," he whispered again, but the words didn't match the movement of his lips. The voice came from his direction, but not from his mouth. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This wasn't right. This wasn't Tom. Then he moved, not toward me. He twitched, his limbs jerking unnaturally, like a puppet whose strings had been yanked. His head cocked to the side, almost as if he was studying me, and I realized with growing horror that whatever I was looking at wasn't Tom at all. It was something else and wearing his face. I turned and ran, crashing through the trees, branches tearing at my skin, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. Behind me I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, uneven, following me, gaining on me. "Help me," the voice called again, louder now, echoing through the woods. But it wasn't Tom's voice anymore. It was deeper, guttural, and wrong. I sprinted back to the camp, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the thing moving through the trees, crashing after me, its voice calling out again and again, twisting and distorting. "Help me, help me." I burst into the clearing, gasping for breath, and spun around to face the trees. The fire was still burning low, casting long shadows across the ground, but there was no sign of the figure, no sign of Tom. Just silence. I grabbed my gear, stuffing everything into my pack as quickly as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip it up. I didn't care about the tent or the fire. I just needed to get out. I needed to get away from whatever was out there, wearing my friend's face. As I made for the trail, I heard the voice one last time, soft and distant. "Help. Me." But this time, I didn't look back. I never saw Tom again. The search parties went out the next day, combing the forest, but they didn't find a trace of him. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, nothing. The official story was that he got lost, maybe injured, and succumbed to the elements, but I know better. Whatever is in those woods, it's still out there, and it's waiting. So if you ever find yourself deep in the forest and you hear a voice calling for help, do yourself a favor. Don't answer. There's a reason locals say you shouldn't camp in the Pine Barrens after dark, but when we booked our trip, I didn't believe in any of that superstitious nonsense. I mean, come on, a creature that's half animal, half human, lurking in the woods, cryptids, skinwalkers. I chalked it all up to urban legends designed to keep tourists out of the more remote parts of New Jersey. If only I'd known then what I know now. It was supposed to be a quick weekend escape, just me, my girlfriend Lisa, and our friend Tony. The three of us had been planning this for weeks, camping under the stars, grilling out, getting away from the noise of the city. We picked a spot in the middle of the barrens, far from the usual hiking trails. Tony insisted on it, said he wanted to be one with nature. It sounded great at the time. We got there late afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip behind the tree line, casting long shadows that made the forest look almost inviting. We pitched our tent, got a fire going, and started grilling some burgers. It was perfect, until the sun finally disappeared. The first weird thing I noticed was the quiet. The Pine Barrens are usually alive with noise at night, crickets, frogs, owls, but as soon as dusk settled in, the woods went dead silent. Lisa mentioned it first, laughing nervously. "You think maybe we scared the wildlife?" I tried to brush it off. "It's probably just the fire. Animals don't like being around people." Tony shrugged and kept poking at the fire, but I could see the unease in his eyes. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet, like the kind of silence that feels wrong. The air around us felt heavier, denser somehow. We all felt it, but none of us wanted to be the first to admit it. Then came the footsteps. At first they were faint, distant, just the soft crunch of something moving through the underbrush. Lisa looked up, her face lit by the firelight, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Probably just a deer," Tony said a little too quickly. "This place is full of them." But I wasn't so sure. The sound was slow and deliberate, like whatever it was moving toward use, not away. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced just beyond the light. I strained my eyes, peering into the darkness, trying to make out anything moving between the trees. But there was nothing. Just blackness. Minutes passed. The footsteps stopped. We all relaxed a little, trying to laugh it off, but the unease lingered. It wasn't until much later, when we'd crawled into the tent and were trying to sleep, that things started getting weird. I must have dozed off for a bit, but I was jerked awake by a sound that sent ice down my spine. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not an animal, not even close. It sounded almost human, but not quite right. It was like someone or something was imitating the sound of a growl, but getting it all wrong. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. "Lisa, did you hear that?" I whispered, shaking her awake. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Hear what?" Then we both heard it. From outside the tent came the distinct sound of footsteps again, slow and heavy, circling us. I could hear the twigs snapping underfoot, the deliberate pace sending a jolt of fear through my veins. Tony was still snoring in the corner, oblivious to it all. Lisa grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "What is that?" I didn't have an answer. Every instinct in my body was screaming to stay still, to not make a sound. I reached over and grabbed the flashlight, turning it on. The beam cut through the darkness inside the tent, but I didn't dare unzip the flap and look outside. The footsteps stopped again right next to us. There was a moment of deafening silence, and then, scratch, 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 something was dragging its claws, no fingers, down the side of the tent, slow and deliberate. I felt Lisa tremble beside me, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mouth went dry as I strained to listen for anything, any sign that whatever was out there had moved on, but the scratching continued. I could barely breathe. And then it spoke. I swear to God I'll never forget that voice. It was low, raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken in years, but it was off, like it was trying to imitate a human voice but didn't quite know how. And it said in a harsh whisper, "Let me in." Lisa's grip on my arm tightened. I could hear her trying not to cry, her body shaking. My own mind raced. Was someone out there? Was it some psycho messing with us? But how would they have found us all the way out here? Then it said it again, this time louder. "Let me in." The voice was closer now, right on the other side of the tent wall. And that's when I noticed the shape pressing against the fabric. There was a face pressed against the tent wall right next to where we were sitting. But it wasn't a person. Its features were distorted, warped, like someone had tried to sculpt a human face out of wet clay and failed miserably. The eyes were hollow, empty sockets, and the mouth, it was just a wide, gaping hole, too large for the face it sat on. Lisa let out a scream, and that's when Tony woke up. "What the hell's going on?" he asked groggily, but before I could respond, the thing outside the tent let out a deafening screech. It was so loud, so sharp, that it felt like knives stabbing into my ears. I didn't think. I just grabbed the knife I'd packed for camping, unzipped the tent, and bolted outside. Lisa and Tony followed close behind, all of us stumbling into the cold night air. The fire had gone out, leaving the clearing bathed in moonlight. I spun around, expecting to see whatever had been out there, but the woods were still, quiet. Not a sound, not a single trace of what had just happened. But I knew it wasn't over. Then I saw it. Standing just at the edge of the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was the thing. It was tall, much taller than any person, its limbs too long, its posture hunched and wrong. And its face, that same distorted face I'd seen pressing against the tent. It tilted its head at us, and that horrible voice came again, soft, almost playful this time. "Let me in." Without thinking, we ran. We didn't even bother packing up our things. We just bolted for the car, sprinting through the woods like our lives depended on it, and maybe they did. I didn't look back, not once, but I swear I could feel it watching us the whole way. When we finally reached the car, we peeled out of there so fast I nearly lost control of the wheel. It wasn't until we were back on the highway, miles from that cursed campsite, that any of us spoke. "What the hell was that?" Tony asked, his voice shaky. None of us had an answer. The next day we went back with a few rangers to grab our stuff. Everything was there, untouched, except for the tent. It was shredded, like something with claws had torn through it during the night. We never spoke about it again. Not really. But I can tell you this. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear that voice, whispering just outside my window. "Let me in." I should have known better than to agree to a camping trip in a place like Devil's Hollow. It's one of those spots you hear about growing up. Everyone has a story about it. A friend of a friend who went out there and never came back, or a hiker who heard something they couldn't explain. It was a place whispered about, always with an air of dread. But I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories or cryptid sightings. To me, it was just another isolated patch of woods, perfect for an adventurous weekend. My buddy, Jake, had suggested the trip. He was always talking about finding the most remote, untouched places to camp, and Devil's Hollow was at the top of his list. "We'll be miles away from civilization," he'd said with a grin. "No cell service, no people, just nature. It's going to be amazing." I should have said no, but I didn't. We drove out on a Friday afternoon, following a winding, narrow road that seemed to get darker the deeper we went. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows through the dense trees. I felt a weird sense of foreboding, but I shrugged it off as pre-trip jitters. We hiked for hours, deeper into the woods than I'd ever been. There were no trails, just Jake's GPS and his knack for navigation. Eventually, we reached a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. It felt claustrophobic, like the forest was pressing in on us from all sides, but Jake was thrilled. "This is it," he said, dropping his pack with a satisfied smile. "Our own little piece of wilderness." We set up camp, built a fire, and cracked open a few beers. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every crack of a branch, every whisper of the wind. But Jake was in his element, talking excitedly about the hike we'd take in the morning, about how untouched this place was. It wasn't long before things started to get strange. It began with the noises. At first it was subtle, rustling in the bushes, the occasional snap of a twig. We both assumed it was just wildlife, maybe a raccoon or deer moving through the trees. But then the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. Footsteps. Not the light, random movement of an animal, but heavy, slow steps, like something was circling the camp just beyond the firelight. "Probably just a bear," Jake said, though he didn't sound as confident as he tried to. We both grabbed flashlights and shone them into the trees, the beams cutting through the thick blackness. But there was nothing, no eyes shining back, no movement, just trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped, and after a while we tried to relax. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something, a low, distant growl, or the crunch of leaves, like something was moving closer. But every time I sat up and looked around, there was nothing there, just the dark, empty woods. In the morning we found something that made my blood run cold. About 20 feet from our tent, scratched into the dirt, were strange markings. At first they looked like claw marks, long and deep, but as I studied them closer, I realized they weren't random. They were symbols, rough, jagged shapes carved into the ground like some kind of crude language. Jake tried to play it off, saying it was probably just some prank from another camper, but we hadn't seen a soul since we arrived. No one should have been out here, and I wanted to leave right then and there, pack up and get the hell out. But Jake, always the adventurous one, insisted we stay. "It's probably nothing," he said, though I could tell he was shaken too. "We came all the way out here. Let's not let some weird markings freak us out." So, against my better judgment, I stayed. The day was uneventful, though the feeling of being watched never went away. I kept catching glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, dark shapes slipping between the trees. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. Jake pretended not to notice, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder. By the time night fell, the unease had grown into full-blown fear. The woods seemed to close in on us, the trees looming tall and oppressive. The fire felt too small, too dim, and the sounds, the footsteps, the rustling, started again, this time louder, closer. I was sitting by the fire staring into the flames when I heard it. A voice. "Help! Me!" It was faint, almost a whisper drifting through the trees. I looked at Jake, thinking maybe he'd said something, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He'd heard it too. "Help! Me!" It came again, clearer this time. A woman's voice, weak and trembling, somewhere in the darkness. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my mouth dry. Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah." We both stood, shining our flashlights into the trees, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of black forest. "Maybe someone's lost," Jake said, though his voice was shaking. "We should check it out." "No way," I snapped. "Something's not right. We need to stay by the fire." But Jake, ever the hero, ignored me and started walking toward the voice, calling out, "Hello? Where are you?" I stayed behind, heart pounding in my chest as I watched the beam of his flashlight bob through the trees, growing fainter the farther he went. And then, just like that, the light disappeared. "Jake!" I yelled, panic gripping me. There was no answer. I stood there trembling, torn between chasing after him and staying by the fire. But before I could make a decision, I heard footsteps. Fast, running footsteps, crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the noise, expecting to see Jake sprinting back toward the camp. But it wasn't Jake, it was something else. I barely had time to register what I was seeing before it was upon me. Tall, hunched, its skin a mottled gray, like something long dead. Its face, if you could call it a face, was a twisted, snarling mass of sharp angles and empty eyes, and its mouth, it was wide, too wide, filled with jagged teeth. I screamed, stumbling backward as the thing barreled toward me, its long clawed hands outstretched. But just as it reached the edge of the firelight, it stopped. It recoiled, hissing like an animal, its black eyes fixed on the flames. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the burning end of a log from the fire and swung it at the creature. It let out a shriek that rattled my bones and disappeared into the darkness, the sound of its retreating footsteps fading into the night. I didn't wait for Jake. I ran as fast as I could, through the trees, through the underbrush, not stopping until I reached the road, breathless and shaking. Jake never came out of those woods. The search teams never found him. But every so often late at night I hear that voice again. "Help! Me!" And I know it's not him. I've worked as a park ranger in Ashwood National Forest for about 5 years now. It's a quiet place, out of the way, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where the trees grow thick and the fog rolls in like a blanket every evening. Most days the job is peaceful, boring even, but I don't mind. I like the solitude, the quiet, the way the forest seems to stretch on forever, untouched by time. That changed last fall. I was stationed in a small outpost about 20 miles from the nearest town, responsible for keeping an eye on the backcountry trails. These trails were barely used, too remote, too dangerous. But every once in a while, hikers would come through, drawn by the challenge or the beauty of the untouched wilderness. It was my job to make sure they didn't get lost, or worse. One chilly October afternoon, I got a call about a missing camper, a guy in his late 20s, traveling alone. He hadn't checked in for a few days, and his family was getting worried. He'd last been seen near a place called Stone Hollow, a part of the forest that most locals avoid. There's a reason for that. Stone Hollow has a reputation, an old legend passed down by the mountain folk. They say it's cursed, that something dark lives there. People talk about strange lights, unnatural sounds, and figures moving through the trees. Things that aren't quite human. I've heard the stories, everyone around here has, but I didn't put much stock in them. I've spent years in these woods and never seen anything I couldn't explain. So, when I got the call, I geared up and set out, figuring it would be a routine search. I'd find the guy probably lost or injured, and we'd head back to the station by nightfall. It didn't turn out that way. The trail to Stone Hollow is rugged, winding through dense forest and over jagged cliffs. The sun was already low in the sky by the time I got close, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was crisp, the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves heavy in the breeze. I radioed in my location, then started down the path that would take me into the hollow. Almost immediately I noticed something was off. The forest was too quiet, no birds, no animals, just the sound of my boots crunching through the leaves. I kept walking, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. About a mile in, I found the camper's tent. It was collapsed, the fabric torn in places like something had ripped it apart in a hurry. There was no sign of him, no blood, no tracks, nothing. That's when I heard the first noise. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A low guttural hum, like a distant engine or the buzz of 1,000 insects. But there was something unnatural about it, something that made my skin crawl. I turned, shining my flashlight through the trees, but saw nothing. I was about to call it in when I heard the whispering. At first I thought it was the wind, rustling through the branches. But then the words became clear, though I couldn't understand them. It was a language I didn't recognize, spoken in hushed, hurried tones. It was coming from deeper in the hollow. I should have turned back right then. Every instinct was screaming at me to leave. But I pressed on, telling myself it was just my imagination, that the missing camper had probably gotten disoriented and was somewhere nearby. The further I went, the louder the whispering became, until it was all around me, echoing through the trees. The path narrowed, leading me down into a depression surrounded by jagged rocks and gnarled, twisted trees. The air here was colder, the mist thicker, and in the center of the hollow stood a large, crumbling stone formation, a ring of ancient, moss-covered rocks that looked like they'd been placed there by someone, or something. That's when I saw him. The missing camper was standing in the middle of the stone circle, his back to me. He was motionless, his head bowed, arms hanging limply at his sides. Relief flooded through me, and I called out to him. He didn't respond. I called again, louder this time, stepping closer. Still nothing. I was maybe 10 feet away when I noticed the smell, an overwhelming stench of rot like something long dead. My gut tightened, and I slowed my approach. "Hey," I called cautiously. "Are you okay?" He moved then, but not like a person should. His head snapped up, too fast, like a puppet yanked on a string. He turned toward me, and that's when I saw his face. It wasn't him. Not really. His eyes were wide, too wide, and black, completely black like pools of ink. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. But it was his eyes that unsettled me the most. They weren't human. They weren't alive. I stepped back, my heart racing, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the thing that was once the camper. Slowly, his mouth began to move, but the words that came out weren't his own. They were the same whispers I'd heard in the trees, the same unrecognizable language, spoken in a voice that was not his. The air grew thick, heavy with an unseen presence. The trees around me seemed to close in, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes, their bark darkening as if soaked in shadows. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and I could feel something moving through the trees. I didn't see it, but I felt it. Something watching me, something hungry. The camper took a step toward me, his limbs jerky, unnatural, his black eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I realized what the locals had meant. Stone Hollow wasn't just cursed, it was alive, or rather, something inside it was, something ancient, and it had claimed him. I finally found my legs and stumbled back, turning and running as fast as I could. The whispers followed me, growing louder, closer, until I could feel them brushing against my skin like icy fingers. I didn't stop until I was halfway back to the outpost, breath ragged, chest tight with fear. When I finally reached the station, I radioed in, but I didn't tell them everything. Just that I hadn't found the camper, that he was likely lost or injured, and that we'd need a search team to go out the next day. I didn't mention the stone circle. I didn't mention the whispers or the black eyes. I didn't tell them about the way the forest had seemed to come alive, or the presence I felt out there in the hollow. Because I knew they wouldn't believe me. I barely believed it myself. But I never went back to Stone Hollow. A search team went out the next day, combed the area for 3 days straight, and found nothing. No tent, no tracks, no camper. It was like he'd never been there. But I know the truth. I know what lives out there, waiting in the mist and the shadows, whispering through the trees. And I'll never go back. Because whatever claimed him is still there, and it's waiting for someone else to wander too deep into the hollow. Waiting to take them too. I've always considered myself a seasoned camper. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, where the forests run wild, endless, and thick. The kind of place where you can lose yourself for days without seeing another human being. It was that solitude I craved when I planned this last trip. No distractions, just me, the trees, and a weekend of hiking. The spot I chose was deep in the Olympic National Park, a remote corner of it that most people avoid due to its rugged terrain and lack of marked trails. That was exactly what appealed to me. I didn't want any noise, any people, just pure wilderness. The drive to the trailhead took most of the day, and by the time I started my hike, the sun was already sinking low in the sky. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and I felt at peace, more relaxed than I had in months. I set up camp by a small creek just before dark, the sound of the water soothing as I lit a fire and settled in for the night. But the peace didn't last. It was around midnight when I first heard the sound. A faint rustling, barely noticeable over the crackle of the fire. At first I brushed it off as the wind or some small animal scurrying through the underbrush, but then it came again, louder this time, like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the camp. I sat up, my pulse quickening. The fire was low now, casting weak flickers of light across the trees, and beyond that, just blackness. My flashlight lay next to me, so I grabbed it, shining the beam into the forest. Nothing, just trees and shadows, and I told myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. But deep down, something didn't feel right. The footsteps, if that's what they were too heavy, too methodical. They didn't belong to an animal. I stayed awake for hours listening, but the sound didn't return. Eventually, I drifted into an uneasy sleep, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day, I decided to push deeper into the forest, hoping the hike would clear my head. I packed up my gear and started moving just as the sun broke through the trees. The trail was rough, barely a path at all, and I had to bushwhack through dense ferns and fallen logs to make any progress. But the deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. It was subtle at first, a sense that the forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the soft crunch of my boots on the forest floor. But then, as the day wore on, I began to notice something else, shapes, in my peripheral vision. Dark figures darting between the trees just out of sight. Every time I turned my head, they were gone. But I could feel them, watching. I tried to rationalize it. I was alone in the woods, my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation was getting to me, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, grew stronger with each step. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon something I couldn't explain. In a small clearing, there were markings on the trees, deep gashes carved into the bark, as if something had clawed at them. The marks were old, but the size and the height of them sent a chill down my spine. They were too large to be from any animal in these woods. And there were bones scattered around the clearing, small ones like deer, but some were snapped clean in half, as if by something with enormous strength. I didn't stay long in that clearing. I pressed on, faster now, the feeling of eyes on my back growing unbearable. The light was starting to fade again, and I knew I needed to find a spot to camp for the night. I settled near a rocky outcrop where I'd have my back to something solid and quickly built a fire. As the night deepened, the forest seemed to close in around me. The fire was bright, but beyond its light, the trees were nothing but looming shadows. And then, just like the night before, the sound started again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the trees around me. I stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, but there was nothing there. Still, the footsteps circled the camp, closer now. I called out, "Who's there?" No answer, just the steady crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. I backed toward the fire, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. Just beyond the light of the fire, something was standing between the trees. At first, I thought it was a person, tall and still, but as I focused, I realized it wasn't right. Its shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its skin pale and stretched taut over bones that jutted out at odd angles. I couldn't see its face, but I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It stood there, motionless, watching me, its head tilted at an unnatural angle like it was studying me. The fire crackled beside me, but I couldn't take my eyes off the thing. And then it moved, not like a person would, but in a series of jerky, unnatural movements, almost like it was glitching, snapping closer with every twitch. My breath caught in my throat, and finally, my body listened. I bolted, grabbing only my backpack, and ran into the night. I don't remember how long I ran, only that the sound of footsteps followed me the entire time. Not running, just walking. Slowly, as if whatever it was knew I couldn't escape. By the time I found my way to the nearest trailhead, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I stumbled out onto the dirt road, gasping for breath, and that's when I saw him, a park ranger standing by his truck. I collapsed at his feet, trying to explain what I had seen, but the words tumbled out in a panicked mess. The ranger's face remained stoic as he listened, but when I mentioned the figure, his expression changed, a flicker of recognition, of fear. "You're lucky," he said quietly when I finished. "Most people who see it don't make it out." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The ranger didn't answer right away. He glanced back toward the woods, then at me. "There are old stories," he said finally, "about things that live deep in these woods, things that don't belong to our world. They mimic, they watch, they hunt." I stared at him, my heart still racing. "Why didn't you warn me?" He looked down at me, his eyes dark. "Would you have listened?" Before I could respond, he helped me into his truck and we drove away, the forest shrinking behind us. But as we turned the corner and the trees faded from view, I swore I saw it again, standing at the edge of the road, watching me. And even now, weeks later, I still feel its eyes on me. Every night, in my dreams, in the shadows outside my window, it's waiting. I've always been a skeptic. Ghosts, monsters, and all that paranormal crap never scared me, even when I was a kid. It was always just a bunch of stories, something to tell around a campfire to spook your friends. But last year, something happened out at Hollow Creek that changed my mind. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun. Me, my girlfriend Emily, and our best friends Jake and Clara planned a camping trip up to Hollow Creek, a dense, sprawling forest, about a 4-hour drive from the city. We'd gone camping plenty of times before, but never here. Hollow Creek was known for its beauty and its isolation, but it also had a reputation. Locals said people who went too deep into the woods often came back different, or sometimes not at all. A bunch of urban legends about creatures lurking in the trees, howling at the moon. But like I said, I didn't buy any of it, and none of us did. We drove up that Friday afternoon, spirits high. The woods were thick, and the further we went, the more the trees seemed to close in around us, like we were driving into a green tunnel. By the time we found a good spot to set up camp, the sun was already setting, casting an eerie orange glow over the trees. We set up our tents and gathered around the fire pit, cracking open beers and roasting marshmallows. For a while it was just the perfect night. Good friends, lots of laughter, and the feeling of being far away from everything. Jake started telling some of those old legends about Hollow Creek, stories about hunters who disappeared without a trace, their screams echoing through the night, and tales of a dogman, a half-wolf, half-human creature with glowing eyes and a blood-curdling howl. It was stupid, but we all played along, pretending to be scared, making over-the-top screams and dramatic gasps. We ended the night howling at the moon and mocking tribute to the dogmen, laughing until our sides hurt. But then came the first howl, and it wasn't ours. It was distant but clear, a long, mournful wail like a wolf but deeper, more guttural. It came from deep in the woods, and it was loud enough to stop all of us mid-laugh. We stared at each other, trying to play it cool, trying to pass it off as a coyote or maybe a wolf, but the way it carried through the trees, it felt wrong, almost human. "Probably just an animal," Jake said, shrugging it off. But his voice shook a little, and the laughter didn't come as easily after that. We eventually called it a night and retreated to our tents. I was sharing one with Emily, but neither of us could sleep. I lay there listening to the sounds of the forest, the wind rustling through the leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. Every noise seemed amplified in the silence of the night, and then that howl again, closer this time. Emily gripped my arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, tight with fear. "Yeah," I whispered back. "It's probably just a wolf. Don't worry about it." But even as I said it, I knew I didn't believe it. That howl sounded different, almost like it was calling out to something, or someone. The howling didn't stop. It continued every hour or so, each time closer, louder, like whatever was out there was circling our camp. I stayed awake all night, clutching the small hunting knife I brought, listening to the rhythmic sound of Emily's anxious breathing. The next morning, everyone was on edge. None of us had slept much, and that carefree vibe from the day before was long gone. We tried to play it off, blaming the wind or wild animals, but deep down, I think we all knew something was wrong. I suggested maybe we pack up and leave, but Jake, stubborn as always, said we'd be fine. Just another night, he insisted, and we'd have a great story to tell. That day was strange. The woods were quiet, too quiet. The usual forest sounds, bird calls, insects buzzing, leaves rustling, were completely absent, like the whole place was holding its breath. It felt like we were being watched. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I half expected to see a face staring back from the tree line. We tried to distract ourselves with hiking and fishing, but every so often we would hear that sound, a twig snap, a low growl, and that damn howl echoing through the forest. Each time it felt like it was getting closer. By dusk, the tension was unbearable. We built up the fire bigger than before, the flames casting long shadows across our campsite. The sun dipped below the trees, and darkness swallowed up the forest. We sat around the fire, not really talking, just staring into the flames, lost in our thoughts. Then Clara stood up suddenly. "Did you guys hear that?" she whispered. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. We all listened, and then I heard it. Footsteps, soft, crunching, slowly approaching from the direction of the trees. I grabbed the flashlight, my hand shaking as I aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the trees, and then we saw it. A figure, just beyond the tree line, tall and hunched, its outline barely visible through the underbrush. It wasn't like anything I'd seen before. Its shape was all wrong. The limbs were too long, the torso too thin, and its head, it was like a wolf's, but stretched, elongated, twisted, and those eyes, bright yellow, reflecting the firelight. "Is that a person?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. The thing stepped closer, revealing its full form in the flashlight's glow. It was covered in matted fur, but it stood on two legs, its head tilted to the side, as if it was studying us. And then it opened its mouth, and that awful howl ripped through the night so loud I felt it in my bones. "Run!" Jake yelled. But before we could move, the thing dropped to all fours and sprinted toward us with a speed I didn't think was possible. It was on us in seconds, knocking over the fire pit and scattering the burning logs everywhere. I grabbed Emily's hand and we ran as fast as we could, not daring to look back. Branches whipped our faces, roots tangled around our feet, but we kept running, hearts pounding, breath coming out in ragged gasps. I could hear Jake and Clara just behind us, the thing's footsteps thundering even closer. It let out that blood-curdling howl again, this time mixed with something else, a distorted, mocking laughter, almost like it was enjoying this. We ran for what felt like hours, blindly tearing through the forest until we saw the car. I fumbled for the keys, almost dropping them as my hands shook uncontrollably. We piled into the car, slamming the door shut, and I floored it, speeding down the dirt road away from whatever was out there. The drive back was a blur. We didn't speak, we didn't stop, just drove until we reached the safety of civilization. When we finally got back to town, we went to the police, but they didn't believe us. Said it was a bear, maybe a coyote, and that we were just spooked. They laughed it off and we never went back. But the nightmares haven't stopped. I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that howl echoing in my head, seeing those yellow eyes staring back at me from the darkness. Sometimes I swear I can hear footsteps outside my window at night, slow and deliberate, circling my house. I never have the courage to look. And last night as I lay in bed, I heard it again, that howl, far off but unmistakable. And then, the laughter. I'll never forget that night. The night the dark woods showed me something I can't explain, something I still don't want to believe. It started as a typical camping trip, just me and 3 friends, Josh, Tyler, and Emily, out in the middle of nowhere, deep in the heart of the Black Ridge Forest. We'd heard it was isolated, quiet, the perfect escape from the noise of the city. But that same isolation would soon turn into a nightmare. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows through the thick canopy of trees. It was beautiful, at first. The air smelled of pine and earth, the kind of crisp, clean scent that made you feel alive. But as the sun started to dip behind the mountains, the forest seemed to change. It was subtle at first, just a strange quiet, as if the birds and insects had suddenly stopped. Josh laughed it off. "Come on, it's just the woods. Relax. We're probably the only people out here for miles." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. And then, right before nightfall, the park ranger showed up. He was an older man, grizzled with deep-set eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. He wore the typical ranger's uniform, but something about him felt off. He didn't smile, didn't even really look at us when he spoke, just stared into the trees like he was searching for something. "You folks camping here tonight?" His voice was gravelly, rough. "Might want to reconsider." Tyler, always the skeptic, chuckled. "Why's that? Bears? Wolves?" The ranger shook his head slowly. "Not exactly." He stepped closer to our fire, his eyes still scanning the tree line. "You ever heard of skinwalkers?" None of us said anything. I'd heard the stories, sure, but I thought they were just legends, creepy tales passed around campfires to scare kids. The ranger continued. "Local legend says these woods are cursed. Things out here, they're not what they seem. You see something, someone that doesn't belong. You turn the other way. Don't engage. Don't follow. Most importantly, don't listen." Emily, trying to lighten the mood, rolled her eyes. "Okay, Ranger, we'll be sure to watch out for any creepy creatures in the dark." But the ranger didn't laugh. He just looked at us, long and hard, before turning back toward the woods. "You've been warned." With that, he disappeared into the trees, leaving us in an uncomfortable silence. The sun had fully set by now, and the only light came from our campfire, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. We laughed it off, at first, tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled over us. But as the night went on, things started to happen. It began with the sounds. At first it was just the wind, or at least that's what I told myself. But then came the rustling, just beyond the reach of the firelight, like something was circling us, staying hidden just out of sight. Josh stood up, grabbing his flashlight, probably just a raccoon or something. He aimed the beam into the trees, but there was nothing there, just darkness, the kind of darkness that swallows light whole. "I don't like this," Emily whispered. "It's too quiet." She was right. The forest had gone deathly still. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just that oppressive silence, like the trees were holding their breath. Suddenly there was a crack, a branch snapping in the distance. Josh swung his flashlight in the direction of the sound, but again there was nothing. Or so I thought. And then I saw it. A figure. Standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the shadows. It looked human, tall, thin, but something was wrong. Its proportions were off. Its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Is that someone?" Tyler muttered, squinting into the darkness. But before we could answer, the figure moved, fast, too fast. It disappeared behind a tree, and I swear, the sound of its footsteps. It wasn't right. It was like clicking, bones snapping. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling. But Josh, always the brave one, scoffed. "It's probably just some weirdo. Come on, don't let the Rangers' ghost stories freak you out." That's when we heard it, a voice, faint, distant, coming from the trees. "Help me." It sounded like a woman, soft, weak. Emily gasped. "Did you hear that? Someone's out there." "No," I whispered. "No one's out there." "Help me." The voice called again, closer this time, but there was something off about it, like it was trying too hard to sound human. Josh pointed his flashlight into the trees, but the beam flickered and died. "Damn batteries." The voice came again, louder. "Please, help me." Emily stood up, panic in her eyes. "We can't just leave someone out there." "No," I grabbed her arm. "The ranger, he warned us. That's not a person." "What are you talking about?" she snapped. "We can't just—" Then the voice changed. It was subtle, but enough to send a chill down my spine. It wasn't pleading anymore. It was mocking. "Help me." It was laughing. And then it stepped out of the trees. The figure, but it wasn't just one. There were two now. They moved in unison, like their limbs were connected by invisible strings, their heads twitching at odd angles. The firelight barely touched them, but I could see their eyes, glowing, reflecting the flames like animal eyes in the dark. Emily screamed. Josh backed up, stumbling over a log. "What the hell is that?" And then they spoke. In our voices. "Help me, please, don't leave me." They were copying us, mimicking. Tyler grabbed his pack. "We need to go now." We ran. I don't know how long we sprinted through the woods, but it felt like hours. The sounds behind us, that awful clicking, the snapping of branches, it was everywhere, surrounding us. When we finally stopped, out of breath and terrified, we realized something horrible. We were back at our campsite. The fire was still burning, flickering weakly in the night, the same clearing, the same trees, as if we'd never left. And then we saw ourselves, sitting by the fire, 4 figures, hunched over, motionless, their backs to us, wearing our clothes, our faces. But they weren't us. Their skin was too tight, too pale, stretched over their bones like they didn't quite fit. And then one of them turned. It smiled. That's when I blacked out. When I woke up, it was morning, and I was alone. The campsite was empty, no sign of Josh, Tyler, or Emily, just the cold, empty forest. And in the distance, I swear I heard it. A voice. My voice. Asking for help. I haven't seen my friends since, and sometimes late at night I hear them, hear me, calling from the woods, but I know better than to answer. There's something about the stillness of the woods at night that unnerves me now. I used to love it, the isolation, the quiet, the way the world feels like it shrinks down to just the flicker of your campfire. But after what happened last fall, I haven't set foot in the forest again. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Just me, my girlfriend Laura, and our dog, Scout. We picked a spot deep in the national forest, a place we'd camped before. It was far from the designated campgrounds, well off any trails, a place where we could really get away. No phone signal, no other people, just the three of us in the wilderness. The drive out there took most of the day, but we reached the clearing in time to set up camp before sunset. It was the perfect spot, nestled between tall pines with a little creek running nearby. I remember standing there, taking in the smell of pine needles and earth, feeling the cool breeze brush my face. It felt like freedom. We spent the evening by the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories like we always did. Scout was dozing happily by the fire, and Laura was leaning against my shoulder, her hair smelling faintly of wood smoke. Everything felt right. But then, just after dark, Scout started acting strange. He was a calm dog, never one to bark without reason, but out of nowhere he shot up, ears pricked, and started growling low in his throat. He stared into the trees, his eyes locked on something we couldn't see. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it in the direction he was focused on, but there was nothing. Just the dark shapes of trees swaying in the wind. Probably just a deer, I said, trying to reassure myself as much as Laura. But Scout wasn't buying it. His growl deepened, his hackles raised. He took a few steps toward the tree line, never breaking his gaze. "Come here, boy," I called, my voice tight. He ignored me, inching closer to the woods, his nose twitching like he had caught a scent. Laura grabbed his collar, pulling him back to the fire. He whined, his eyes still darting into the darkness. That's when we heard it. A faint rustling in the bushes, like something was moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was slow, deliberate, too loud to be the wind. I swung the flashlight around again, the beam cutting through the night. But whatever it was, stayed hidden. We sat in tense silence, straining to hear, but the sound faded away. After a while, Laura managed to calm Scout down, though he kept his eyes on the trees, his body tense. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but that sense of unease lingered. It wasn't the first time I'd heard animals moving around the woods at night while camping, but this was different. There was something deliberate about the sound, something almost too cautious. The next day, we decided to take a hike up the ridge nearby. It was one of those beautiful autumn mornings, crisp and bright, with the sun filtering through the trees in golden beams. The hike helped shake off the tension from the night before. We climbed for a few hours, Scout bounding ahead, his usual energetic self. By the time we got back to camp, the uneasy feeling from the night before was almost forgotten. But that evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees, things took a turn. I was gathering some wood for the fire when I noticed something strange. In the clearing, about 30 yards from our campsite, there was something hanging from a low branch. I thought it was a bundle of leaves at first, caught up in the wind, but as I got closer I realized it wasn't leaves at all. It was fur. Not just any fur, though. It was black and matted, tied together with bits of twine and something else. Small bones, maybe? It hung there, swaying gently in the breeze. My stomach churned. I hadn't seen it the day before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been there until recently. I called Laura over and we both stared at it, confused and unsettled. "What is that?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," I replied, pulling it down to get a closer look. It was crudely tied together, like someone had made it on the fly. The bones were small, too small to be anything big, maybe a bird or some kind of rodent. But it was the fur that bothered me. It looked fresh. Scout was whining again, pacing around the campsite, his eyes darting toward the trees. We decided to ignore it. Maybe it was some weird art project from a previous camper or some hunter's strange good luck charm. It didn't matter. We were out here to enjoy the weekend, and I wasn't about to let some creepy totem ruin that. But that night, the woods were different. The silence that had felt peaceful before now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed amplified in the dark. Scout wouldn't settle, pacing around the tent, growling at intervals. I lay there staring at the ceiling of the tent, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then the tapping started. It was soft at first, like someone gently rapping on a tree just beyond the campsite. Tap, tap. Then silence. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from all around us, echoing through the woods. Laura sat up, her eyes wide with fear. I grabbed the flashlight, my hand shaking, and shined it outside the tent. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Then I heard it, a soft, lilting voice, barely a whisper, carried on the wind. Come. It was distant, almost impossible to hear, but there was no mistaking it. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, and it was calling us. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. I turned in every direction, scanning the tree line with the flashlight. But there was nothing. Then the tapping grew louder. I shined the light toward the trees where the sound was coming from, and that's when I saw it, just for a second. A shape, pale, human-like but twisted, with long, gaunt limbs and a face that looked wrong, its eyes too large and black, its mouth too wide, grinning. It darted behind a tree before I could focus the light on it, but I knew what I had seen. Laura was at my side now, clutching Scout's leash. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't argue. We packed up as quickly as we could, the tapping growing more frantic with every passing second. The voice was louder now, insistent. "Come." We left most of our gear behind, grabbing only what we needed, and started running. Scout pulled ahead, barking wildly as we made our way through the trees, the sound of the tapping following us. I kept the flashlight trained ahead, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't until we reached the car that the sound finally stopped. We didn't speak the entire drive home. When we got back to town, I went online, trying to find any explanation for what we had experienced. That's when I found the stories about the Wendigo, a creature said to roam the woods, luring people with whispers, tapping on trees to disorient them, stalking them until they're lost and alone. We haven't gone camping since, but sometimes late at night when the wind is just right, I think I hear it, the tapping, and the voice. Camping has always been my escape. The smell of pine, the crackle of a fire, the kind of silence that only the deep woods can offer. It's where I go to clear my head. This trip was supposed to be no different. Just me, a weekend alone in the wilderness, away from work, from stress, from everything. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. I never imagined it would end like this. I drove out to Reddington Forest, a stretch of dense woods about 4 hours from the nearest town. The place was perfect, remote, untouched, with no hiking trails or campsites to attract crowds. In other words, exactly what I wanted, total solitude. I'd been there once before, but only for a day trip. This time, I planned on staying 2 nights, long enough to disconnect, but short enough to not worry anyone if I went off the grid for a while. I should have told someone where I was going. It started off perfectly. The weather was cool, the air crisp with the scent of pine needles and moss. I set up camp near a small clearing, just a stone's throw from a creek that bubbled quietly over rocks. The first day was peaceful, exactly what I needed. I spent it exploring the area, wandering through the trees, taking in the quiet. By dusk, I was sitting by my fire, watching the sky fade from deep blue to black, stars spilling out one by one. That night, I woke up to the sound of tapping. At first, I thought it was just a branch hitting my tent. The wind had picked up, and trees can make all kinds of noises in the night. I rolled over, trying to ignore it, but the tapping was persistent, rhythmic. It wasn't random like a branch would be. It was steady, intentional, like someone or something was drumming its fingers against the fabric of the tent. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence, the kind that presses in on you, heavy and suffocating. Then it started again. Tap, tap, tap. My mind raced. There was no one else out here, I'd made sure of that. I didn't hear footsteps, no rustling in the underbrush, just that eerie, methodical tapping. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, heart hammering in my chest. I shone the light into the clearing. Nothing, just the fire, now reduced to glowing embers and the dark shapes of trees all around. I swept the beam across the ground, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the light. But there was nothing, just stillness. I let out a breath and backed into the tent, zipping it up tightly behind me. Maybe it was a loose branch after all, or some animal curious about the tent. That's what I told myself as I lay back down, staring at the thin fabric between me and the night. I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the tapping from the night before felt like a weird dream. I shook it off and decided to hike deeper into the forest. I figured a good day's hike would tire me out enough that I wouldn't be kept awake by any strange noises. I spent hours walking, exploring the dense woods that seemed to stretch on forever. The deeper I went, the more ancient the forest felt. Trees towered over me, their gnarled roots twisting out of the earth like claws. The air smelled damp, rich with the scent of decaying leaves and wet soil. It felt different, like I had crossed some invisible boundary. That's when I saw it, or rather them. Carvings deep into the bark of several trees were symbols, strange, jagged symbols that I didn't recognize. They looked old, weathered, as if they had been there for years, but at the same time, there was something about them that felt recent, fresh almost. I ran my fingers over one of the carvings and my skin prickled. A deep unease settled over me. I've hiked in a lot of forests, but I've never seen anything like this. They weren't the usual initials or heart-shaped carvings couples leave behind. These symbols felt wrong, deliberate but without any obvious meaning. I decided it was time to head back to camp. The further I walked, the heavier the air seemed to get. The trees loomed taller, and the light filtering through the canopy grew dimmer, casting long, creeping shadows across the forest floor. The sense of being watched crept over me like a cold hand on the back of my neck. By the time I made it back to camp, it was late afternoon. I quickly gathered more wood for the fire, hoping the flames would chase away the unease that had clung to me all day. But that night, it got worse. I woke up again, but this time it wasn't tapping. It was whispering, faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Voices, low, hushed voices, like a conversation being carried out just beyond the thin walls of my tent. I froze, every muscle tense, straining to hear. The words were garbled, impossible to make out, but the tone was unmistakable, whispered, almost urgent, as if whoever or whatever was speaking didn't want to be overheard. I slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to peek out, holding my breath. My flashlight was in my other hand, but I didn't turn it on yet. The campfire was nearly dead, casting a weak, flickering light around the clearing. And then I saw them, figures, tall, impossibly tall, standing just beyond the firelight. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. Their forms were thin, too thin to be human, their limbs long and spindly like the branches of the trees. I couldn't make out their faces, if they even had faces, just dark, elongated silhouettes. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. My mind raced, screaming at me to do something, anything. But I was frozen, paralyzed by the sight of them. Then one of them moved. It stepped forward just enough that the weak firelight caught the edge of its figure. Its limbs moved in slow, unnatural jerks, like it wasn't quite sure how to walk. And then it tilted its head, its body twisting at an impossible angle, as if studying me, as if deciding whether or not I was worth approaching. That was all it took. I scrambled out of the tent, adrenaline surging through me as I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't care where I was going, didn't care that it was the middle of the night, or that I didn't know my way out of the forest in the dark. I just ran. Behind me, I could hear the whispers growing louder, more frantic, like they were calling after me. The footsteps, heavy, thudding footsteps, followed me through the trees, but I didn't dare look back. The air was thick, oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides as I tore through the forest. I don't know how long I ran, but somehow by some miracle I found the dirt road that led back to the parking area. My car was still there, untouched, like a lifeline waiting for me. I didn't even stop to catch my breath as I jumped in and sped down the narrow road, my hands shaking on the wheel. I haven't been back to those woods since. I don't plan to. But sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear it, that low, rhythmic tapping. And when I close my eyes, I see those tall, twisted figures standing just beyond the edge of the light, watching, waiting. The fire crackled, casting a soft glow over the campsite as we sat in a tight circle. It was supposed to be a fun trip, just me, my brother Ben, and his girlfriend Emily. A quick getaway into the wilderness to relax before summer ended. But as the night deepened and the last hints of daylight faded, a creeping sense of isolation started to settle over us. The woods around us were dense, the trees towering high above, their branches twisted like bony fingers. The firelight didn't reach far into the forest, leaving the edges of the campsite swallowed in thick, oppressive darkness. There was no moon that night, just a thick blanket of stars, and the silence was too complete. "You know," Ben said, breaking the quiet, "I heard a weird story about these woods." I rolled my eyes. Ben always liked to stir up ghost stories when we were out camping, but something about the night, about the way the trees seemed to be watching us, made me a little more uneasy than usual. "What kind of story?" Emily asked, though her voice held a nervous edge. Ben smirked, leaning closer to the fire, his face cast in eerie shadow. "There's a legend that goes way back. Supposedly this forest is cursed. Something about a Native American tribe that used to live here. They were massacred when settlers first came through the area, but before the last of them died, they placed a curse on these woods. They said anyone who disturbed their land would never leave the forest again." I gave a sarcastic chuckle. "Real original, Ben. Ghost stories and curses. What next? Bigfoot?" But Ben wasn't laughing. His eyes were fixed on the fire, his face serious now. "It's not just a story. A lot of people have gone missing in these woods. They say the forest gets inside your head, messes with your mind, and if you wander too far off the trail, you'll never find your way back." Emily shivered and glanced nervously into the dark woods surrounding us. "That's creepy." I shrugged it off, trying to keep the mood light. "Come on, we've been out here all day and haven't seen anything weirder than a squirrel." But as the words left my mouth, I realized how quiet it had become. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just the soft crackle of the fire. And that uneasy feeling in my stomach deepened. "Look," Ben said, breaking the silence. "It's probably nothing, but we should be careful. Just stay close to camp, all right?" I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Ben wasn't telling us everything. He had a way of playing things off like a joke, but I could tell something had rattled him earlier. I wondered if he'd seen something when we hiked in. The fire began to die down, so I stood to grab more firewood from the pile we'd gathered earlier. I took a few steps toward the edge of the camp, keeping an eye on the thin line between light and dark. But as I bent down to pick up a log, something flickered in my peripheral vision. At first I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, the way light dances off shadows in the forest. But then I saw it again. A flash of movement between the trees. Something pale. Too quick. Too quiet. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, turning back to Ben and Emily. They both stared at me, confused. "See what?" Ben asked, standing up. There was something in the trees." I pointed into the darkness where I thought I saw the movement, but it was gone now. My heart thudded in my chest. I forced a laugh, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, probably a deer or something. Emily stood too, her eyes scanning the tree line. "I don't like this," she whispered. Ben shrugged, but there was an edge to his voice now. "We're in the woods. Animals are everywhere. It's fine." I nodded, but as we stood there staring into the blackness beyond the fire, that creeping unease settled in again. The forest felt alive, but not in the way it should. It felt like it was waiting, watching. Suddenly, there was a loud snap from deep in the trees, a branch breaking. I jumped, dropping the log I was holding. Ben grabbed the flashlight and pointed it into the woods, his hands trembling. "What the hell was that?" Emily whispered. Ben didn't answer. He just kept the light trained on the trees, scanning back and forth. The beam bounced off the trunks, casting long, eerie shadows. And then, just at the edge of the light, something moved. I saw it clearly this time. A figure, pale and gaunt, barely human-shaped. It moved unnaturally, its limbs too long, its body hunched, almost crawling on all fours. For a split second it stopped, turning its head toward us, and I saw its eyes, hollow, black, like twin voids in the night. "Run," Ben whispered, his voice tight with fear. "We have to go, now." We didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing only what we could carry, we bolted, leaving the fire, the tents, everything behind. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear something moving in the woods, keeping pace with us. Its breath. A horrible wheezing sound grew louder as we ran. Branches whipped at my face and my heart pounded in my ears. I could barely see, the flashlight bobbing wildly in Ben's hand. I wanted to scream, but terror had locked my throat. Emily was sobbing behind me, her footsteps stumbling as she tried to keep up. Then, just when I thought we were far enough, Ben tripped. The flashlight flew out of his hand, spinning across the ground, and for a brief moment we were plunged into darkness. In that instant, I heard it. A voice, soft and whispery, coming from the woods. "Come back," it said. "Stay with us." I froze, my blood turning to ice. It wasn't just any voice. It was my voice, but distorted, warped, like a broken record. "Come back." Ben scrambled to his feet, grabbing the flashlight again, and we took off running. But no matter how fast we went, the voice followed, growing louder, echoing between the trees. "Come back." And then we burst into the clearing where we had parked the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. As we piled in, I glanced back at the tree line. For a moment everything was still, silent. Then, from the shadows, the figure stepped out. Taller now, its pale, twisted form fully visible in the moonlight. It smiled, its lips stretching impossibly wide, revealing jagged, rotting teeth. And it spoke again. "Come back." But this time, it wasn't my voice. It was Ben's. I floored the gas and we tore down the dirt road, leaving the creature and the forest behind. We never went back. And the next day, when we told the ranger what we'd seen, he gave us a strange look. He just shook his head and said, "You're not the first." And something in his eyes told me we wouldn't be the last. I've been a park ranger for almost 10 years, stationed at various national parks across the country. I've dealt with bears, mountain lions, lost hikers, and every kind of wild animal you can imagine. But nothing, not even my time in the Marines, prepared me for what happened in the Bitterroot National Forest last summer. I haven't told anyone the full story, not even my wife. It's not that I don't want to, it's just, I don't know how to explain what I saw out there. It was mid-July, the height of tourist season. People were pouring into the park, eager for a weekend of camping and hiking. I was stationed in a remote section of the forest, an area known for its dense trees, steep ridges, and winding trails. It was beautiful, but it had a reputation among the rangers, a place where people got lost, where strange things happened. The locals called it Dead Man's Hollow. I'd always thought it was just an old nickname, something to spook new rangers. Turns out it was more than that. On the second night of my patrol, a call came in on the radio around dusk. A family had reported strange noises near their campsite, howling, loud crashes, and what they described as guttural moaning. They were spooked, but no one had been hurt, so I was sent to check it out. No big deal. Animals get rowdy, especially in the summer. Sometimes a coyote or a bobcat can make sounds that'll send shivers down your spine if you're not used to the wild. I hopped in my truck and made the drive out to the trailhead. The family's campsite was about a mile from the road, down a narrow trail that cut through thick pine trees and underbrush. The deeper I went, the darker the forest became. It felt wrong. I know how that sounds, but it's the only way I can describe it. The trees seemed to close in around me, and even the birds were silent. The only sound was my boots crunching on the dirt path and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere out in the dark. When I reached the campsite, the family, 2 parents and their teenage son, were already packed up and ready to leave. They looked shaken, the mother especially. She kept glancing over her shoulder, like she expected something to come out of the trees at any moment. The father was more composed, but his hands were trembling as he talked. "It started just after sunset," he said, pointing into the trees. "Howling, like something was hurt. Then the crashing. Something big was out there, breaking branches, circling the camp." His son chimed in. "We thought it was a bear, but it didn't sound right. The noises were wrong." I asked if they'd seen anything, but they shook their heads. Whatever it was, it had stayed out of sight, just beyond the tree line. I reassured them that it was probably a coyote, or maybe a big buck moving through the brush. They didn't seem convinced, but they were eager to get out of there. I helped them carry their gear back to their car, and after a few more reassurances, they left. I should have left too, but I had to check it out. It was my job after all. I hiked back to the campsite, listening carefully for any unusual sounds. At first there was nothing, just the rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant call of an owl. I circled the perimeter of the campsite, looking for tracks or signs of an animal, but everything seemed normal, until I found the footprints. They were just beyond the edge of the campsite, partially hidden by the underbrush. At first glance they looked like deer tracks, split hooves, deep impressions in the dirt. But as I followed them, they started to change. The prints grew larger, wider, the deep impressions more spaced out, and then they weren't hooves anymore. They were something else. Long, narrow, almost like a human foot, but with claws at the tips. The kind of tracks that shouldn't exist. My heart started to race, but I pushed the panic down. It had to be a bear or maybe even a wolf with an injured paw. My mind was scrambling for a rational explanation, but the more I followed the tracks, the harder it became to believe that. The trail led deeper into the forest, away from the campsite, twisting and turning through dense undergrowth. The trees were so thick now that the sky was barely visible through the canopy, and the shadows felt alive, shifting with every step I took. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural moan, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground. It was close, too close. I froze. Every muscle in my body tensed, straining to locate the source of the sound. It came again, louder this time, and accompanied by a crashing noise, something moving through the trees, heavy and deliberate. Whatever it wasn't trying to hide anymore. I should have run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of there. But instead, I stepped forward, deeper into the trees, flashlight sweeping the darkness. The air grew colder, and that smell hit me, like rotting meat, sickly sweet and overwhelming. My stomach turned. I stopped when I saw it. In the beam of my flashlight, not more than 20 feet ahead, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, hunched over, back turned toward me. But as the light hit it, the thing rose to its full height, well over 7 feet, and turned slowly to face me. Its body was wrong, twisted. The arms were too long, its legs bent at an unnatural angle. Patches of its skin were stretched too tight over bones, while other parts hung loose, rotting. Its face. God, I'll never forget its face. The eyes were dark, hollow pits, and its mouth was a gaping maw of jagged teeth, almost as if it had been stretched too wide. And it smiled at me. That was enough. I turned and ran, crashing through the trees, not caring about the noise or the branches that whipped against my face. I could hear it behind me, moving fast, faster than anything that size should be able to move. The crashing of branches, that horrible moaning, and, worst of all, the laughter. It was faint, barely audible over my own ragged breaths, but it was there. High-pitched, mocking. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but it was probably just minutes. By the time I made it back to the trailhead, I couldn't hear it anymore. The forest was silent again. But I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I never reported what I saw. What could I say? That some creature straight out of a nightmare was prowling the woods? They'd think I'd lost it. Hell, sometimes I wonder if I did. But I know what I saw. And I know I wasn't imagining it. I put in for a transfer not long after that, got stationed at a park out west, where the forests aren't quite so dense, where I can see the sky. But even now, sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the laughter. Camping trips are supposed to be fun, a way to disconnect from the world and reconnect with nature. I thought that's what this trip would be, a few days in the remote wilderness with my friends. But there are places in this world you're not supposed to go, places that belong to something else. I didn't know that when we decided to camp deep in Blackwater Forest. I didn't know what waited for us in the shadows between the trees. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Tyler, and our 2 friends Liz and Nate. We'd been planning this trip for months, determined to find a place far off the beaten path where we could really be alone. Blackwater was perfect. No phone service, no roads for miles, just towering pines and an endless sea of green. The first day was amazing. We hiked deep into the woods, laughing, joking, the weight of the real world melting away. We found a small clearing, surrounded by trees so thick you couldn't see the sky. It felt hidden, secret. We set up camp, started a fire, and let the day fade into night as the stars began to peek through the canopy above. But as the sun dipped lower, things started to feel wrong. It was subtle at first. The air grew colder, sharper, like the forest was breathing down our necks. The fire crackled loudly, but there was a strange stillness beyond its glow. The usual sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant animal calls were gone, replaced by a heavy, unnatural silence. "Do you guys hear that?" Liz asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all stopped talking, listening. At first there was nothing, just that oppressive silence. Then faintly, we heard it, whispering. It was so soft it was hard to tell where it was coming from, but it was there. Low, unintelligible voices carried on the wind. Tyler laughed it off, saying it was just the breeze in the trees, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. The whispers were too deliberate, too constant. That night, none of us slept well. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I could hear those voices just beyond the edge of the clearing, whispering, murmuring things I couldn't understand. The next day, we hiked farther into the forest, trying to shake off the weird vibes from the night before. But the deeper we went, the stranger things got. The trees seemed closer together. Their branches knotted in unnatural patterns. Shadows moved in the corner of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just trees. Just the forest. But I could feel it. Something was watching us. We found a stream around noon and stopped to rest. Nate was kneeling at the edge, filling his water bottle, when he suddenly stood up, staring across the water. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice tight. "See what?" Tyler replied, glancing around. There, across the stream, someone was standing there watching us. I looked, but there was no one, just the dense forest on the other side. Dark, impenetrable. "You probably just saw a deer or something," I said, trying to convince myself more than him. But Nate wasn't convinced. He was pale, his eyes scanning the trees. No, it wasn't a deer. It was a person. That night back at camp, the feeling of being watched grew worse. The whispers returned, louder this time, almost circling the camp. We sat around the fire, trying to ignore them, but the tension was thick. Liz kept glancing over her shoulder, and Nate hadn't spoken since the stream. Sometime after midnight, Tyler stood up, agitated. "All right, this is stupid," he said. "It's just the wind. You guys are freaking yourselves out." He grabbed a flashlight and started walking toward the trees. "I'm going to prove there's nothing out there." "Tyler, wait!" I called after him, but he waved me off. He walked into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the trees. For a moment we saw him moving between the trunks, the light bouncing. And then he was gone. The light clicked off, and the forest swallowed him. We waited 5 minutes, 10, 15. "Tyler," I shouted, but there was no answer, just the whispers, the same incessant whispers. Nate and I grabbed our flashlights, fear gnawing at my gut, and went after him. The trees felt closer than before, like they were pressing in on us, their branches reaching for our skin. We called Tyler's name, but there was no sign of him, nothing but the endless forest and the whispers growing louder. After what felt like hours, we found him. He was standing in a small clearing, his back to us, staring up at something. The beam from my flashlight caught him just as he turned. My stomach dropped. His face. It was blank, emotionless, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Tyler?" I said, my voice shaky. He didn't respond. He just stared, his mouth opening slightly like he was about to say something. But what came out wasn't his voice. It was a low guttural sound, a deep rasping growl, like something trying to speak through him. His head jerked unnaturally, twisting toward the trees behind us, and that's when I saw it. A figure, tall, pale, standing between the trees. Its skin was stretched too tightly over its bones, its limbs impossibly long, its eyes black, hollow. It stared at us with a hunger that made my blood turn cold. Without thinking, I grabbed Tyler's arm and pulled him, dragging him back toward camp. Nate was right behind us, his flashlight bouncing wildly. The whispers were deafening now, coming from all directions, like the trees themselves were speaking. We ran. Back at camp, Liz was waiting, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened? What's out there?" she asked, but I didn't have time to explain. "We need to leave, now." We packed up what little we could and started hiking out, the feeling of being watched pressing down on us with every step. The whispers followed us, growing quieter as we put distance between us and the clearing, but they never stopped. It wasn't until we were back in the car, speeding down the access road, that Tyler finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I saw it," he said, staring out the window. "I saw it in the trees. It wasn't human." None of us said anything after that. What could we say? We had seen something in those woods, something that didn't belong in this world, something that wanted us to stay. I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see the figure standing between the trees, waiting. It's out there somewhere, and it's watching, waiting for someone to wander too far into the whispering pines. I've been camping my whole life. Growing up, my dad would take me and my older brother, Jason, out into the wilderness every summer. I'd learned how to set up tents, start fires, and navigate the woods with just a compass and the stars. I thought I knew the woods, but nothing prepared me for what happened on that trip last October. It was just the three of us, Jason, me, and my best friend Dylan. We were heading to a place deep in the national forest, miles from the nearest trailhead. Jason had heard about this spot from some guy at a bar, some off-the-grid campsite tucked into a valley surrounded by towering pine trees. He swore it was the perfect place for stargazing, totally isolated. We hiked for hours that day, the trail disappearing until we were blazing our own path through the underbrush. By the time we found the spot, the sun was already low on the horizon, casting the sky in hues of pink and orange. It was perfect, just like Jason said. A clearing in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick, ancient pines. We set up camp quickly just before dusk, A cool breeze rustled through the treetops, but it wasn't unpleasant. It felt like the woods were alive, breathing around us. We joked around the fire, passing a flask of whiskey, the flames dancing as we swapped old stories. The moon hung high and full above us, casting silver light through the branches. It should have been peaceful, but something was off. I noticed it first, the smell. It wasn't your usual forest scent of pine and earth. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger as the night wore on. It smelled like something rotting, like an animal that had died and been left to decay in the woods. "Do you smell that?" I asked, wrinkling my nose. Dylan nodded, glancing around. "Yeah, man. Maybe a deer died nearby or something." Jason shrugged it off, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me. The smell wasn't normal, and it seemed to come from all directions, as if the forest itself was steeped in decay. I told myself I was overthinking it, but I couldn't shake the chill crawling up my spine. As the fire died down and the night grew darker, the noises began. At first it was faint, just a whisper like the wind shifting through the trees. But then I realized it wasn't the wind. It was voices. Low, murmuring voices carried through the night. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered, scanning the trees. Jason paused, his brow furrowing. "Hear what?" "The voices," I said, my heart pounding. "It sounds like whispering." Dylan leaned closer to the fire, his face lit up with unease. "It's just the wind, man. You're freaking yourself out." But I knew it wasn't the wind. The whispers were growing louder, more distinct, like they were circling us, coming from the darkness just beyond the firelight. Then, without warning, the forest went completely silent. No wind, no insects, no crackling of the fire. Just nothing. I turned to Jason, but before I could speak, we heard it. A soft crunch of leaves, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the trees. Dylan stood up, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "What the hell is that?" Jason grabbed his own flashlight, sweeping it through the trees. "Probably an animal," he muttered, but even his voice wavered. We stood there, flashlights cutting through the darkness, hearts pounding in unison, waiting. Then we saw it. A figure, tall, hunched, standing just beyond the reach of our lights. It was watching us. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted, trying to make out any details. It was too far to see clearly, but something about it was wrong. Its shape was distorted, like it didn't fit the space it occupied, as if the shadows clung to it unnaturally. "Who's there?" Jason called out, trying to sound confident. The figure didn't move. "Dude, let's just pack up and get out of here," Dylan whispered, his voice trembling. Jason shook his head, his jaw tight. "It's just someone messing with us." I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew. No one else was supposed to be out here. No one else could be out here. This place was too remote. Suddenly the figure moved, but not toward us. It slipped back into the shadows, vanishing between the trees without a sound. And just like that, the forest came alive again. The wind picked up, the fire crackled, the distant sound of insects resumed. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rush of blood in my ears. Jason didn't answer. He just stood there, staring into the woods, his face pale. We sat in silence for a while, no one willing to admit how terrified we were. But after what felt like hours, we finally decided to call it a night. Jason insisted we stay, that it was nothing, just some hiker passing through. But I saw the way his hands shook as he zipped up his tent. I couldn't sleep. Every little sound jolted me awake, my mind replaying the image of that figure over and over again. I lay there, listening to the forest, the whispers creeping back into the edges of my consciousness. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps outside my tent. I shot up, heart racing. They were slow, shuffling, moving through the campsite. I held my breath, straining to listen, praying it was just Jason or Dylan going for a piss break. Then I heard the zipper of Jason's tent. "Jason," I whispered. No response. The footsteps continued, but they weren't moving away. They were circling the tents. Around and around. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped my tent just a crack, peeking out. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and I froze. Standing in the middle of the campsite, facing away from me, was Jason. "Jason," I whispered again, louder this time, but he didn't move. I stepped out of the tent, flashlight shaking in my hand. "Jason, what the hell are you doing?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, unnaturally still, his back to me. As I approached him, my flashlight flickered, and in that split second of darkness, I heard it, a whisper, right by my ear. "Run!" I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. When I turned back to Jason, he was gone. Panic surged through me. I ran to Dylan's tent, shaking him awake. "Dylan, we need to go, now." We grabbed our gear, not even bothering to pack everything properly, and bolted. We ran through the woods, not stopping, not looking back. The entire time I could feel it. Something was following us. The whispers grew louder, circling us, closing in. When we finally reached the car, we drove like hell out of there, not saying a word. We never found Jason. Search parties combed the area for weeks, but he was gone. Just gone. No trace, no tracks, nothing. But here's the thing that still haunts me. A week after we returned, I got a text from Jason's number. Just one word. "Run." I don't go camping anymore. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend, just me and my girlfriend Hannah out in the woods, away from everything. We needed this trip, something to clear our heads, to get us back on track. Lately, life had been weighing us down, the stress, the arguments, the distance creeping in like a slow poison. This was meant to fix that. We picked a spot far from any other campsites, isolated on the edge of a dense, sprawling forest. It was the kind of place where the world felt untouched, ancient. You could feel the weight of the years in the air, thick and still, almost like time itself had forgotten this place. It was perfect. The first day was uneventful. We set up the tent, gathered firewood, and cooked dinner as the sun dipped low, casting the woods in a warm, orange glow. For the first time in weeks, we laughed. It felt good, normal. I started to believe this trip might actually fix things between us. That night, though, things started to get strange. It was around midnight when I woke up, the fire outside just embers, casting flickering shadows against the tent. Hannah was still asleep beside me, her breathing soft and steady. But something had stirred me, some sound just beyond the thin walls of the tent, a low rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I strained to listen, my heart beating faster. At first, I thought it might just be a deer, or maybe the wind moving the leaves. But the sound was too deliberate, too human. I sat up, careful not to wake Hannah, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The forest was dark, the moon barely lighting the tops of the trees. At first I didn't see anything, just the silhouettes of the trees and the faint glow of the dying fire. But then, from the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A shape, low to the ground, moving slowly through the bushes at the edge of the clearing. It was too dark to make out details, but the way it moved, it wasn't right. It didn't walk, it slithered. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I stared at the spot where I had seen it, but whatever it was had disappeared, melting into the blackness of the trees. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably just an animal. I zipped the tent back up and laid down, pulling Hannah closer. But sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning I mentioned it to Hannah, but she just shrugged it off. "It's the woods, babe. There are animals everywhere." She was probably right. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but that unease lingered in the back of my mind all day. We spent the day hiking deeper into the forest. The trees here were massive, their branches intertwining like skeletal hands reaching out to block the sun. There was something oppressive about the woods the further in we went, the kind of silence that pressed in on you from all sides, like the world was holding its breath. The strangest part, though, was how we never saw anyone else. Not a single hiker, not even a distant trail. This place was completely empty, like we were the only ones left in the world. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was setting again, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and warp the landscape. The fire crackled to life as I lit it, and for a moment, things felt normal again. We cooked dinner, drank some wine, and sat by the fire, talking and laughing like nothing had happened the night before. But when the fire started to die down, that feeling returned, that oppressive silence, that sense of being watched. I kept glancing into the trees, expecting to see movement, to see that shape from the night before. But there was nothing, just the dark, endless forest. We decided to turn in for the night, and I tried to push the unease to the back of my mind. But as soon as we crawled into the tent, I knew something was wrong. The air inside felt wrong. It smelled faintly of earth, damp and decaying. At first I thought it was just the forest, but it was too strong, too close. I turned to Hannah, but she had already drifted off, her back to me. I wanted to wake her, to tell her that something felt off, but I didn't. I didn't want to seem paranoid, to ruin the trip we so desperately needed. Then I heard it again, the rustling. But this time, it wasn't outside. It was inside the tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint, like something shifting beneath the fabric of the tent floor. I reached out slowly, my hand trembling as I pressed it against the floor. I could feel something moving underneath, a slow, subtle writhing like something alive was buried just beneath us. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled my hand back, trying not to make a sound. I turned to shake Hannah awake, but when I touched her shoulder, she didn't stir. "Hannah?" I whispered, my voice shaking. No response. I shook her again, harder this time. "Hannah!" She rolled over, her eyes closed, her face pale and slack. My stomach dropped. Her skin was ice cold. I scrambled out of the sleeping bag, grabbing the flashlight. I shined it on her, my hands trembling, my mind racing. She was breathing, but barely. Her skin was covered in a thin layer of dirt, like she'd been lying in the ground. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. I shook her again, harder. "Hannah, wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, but they weren't. Right. They were dull, lifeless, like she wasn't really seeing me. Then, slowly, her mouth opened. "Get out," she whispered, her voice flat, mechanical. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind spinning. What are you—" "Get out," she repeated, her voice more urgent now, her eyes locking onto mine, but they weren't Hannah's eyes anymore. Something else was looking at me through them, something ancient and cold. Before I could move, she sat up, her movement stiff, unnatural. The dirt on her skin began to crack and fall away, revealing something dark and slick underneath, something that wasn't human. I scrambled backward, my foot catching on the edge of the tent, and I fell hard against the ground outside. As I lay there gasping for breath, I saw her crawl out of the tent, her limbs contorting, twisting into unnatural angles. That's when I realized this wasn't Hannah anymore. It never had been. Not since last night. The thing wearing her skin tilted its head, staring at me with those hollow eyes, its mouth twisting into a grotesque smile. And then it spoke in a voice that was no longer hers. "She's with us now. You should have left." I didn't stay to hear anything else. I ran, deeper into the forest, the thing's laughter echoing behind me. And now as I sit here writing this, I can still hear it in the distance. It's coming for me. I don't think I'll make it out of these woods. But if you ever find this, don't go looking for her. Don't go looking for me." I've always loved camping, the peace, the solitude, the freedom. But after what happened last weekend, I don't know if I'll ever set foot in the woods again. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just me and two of my friends, Jason and Mark. We'd found a secluded spot online, deep in the heart of a national forest, hours away from the nearest town. It was one of those places you couldn't find on a map, a hidden gem. The perfect getaway, we thought. The drive up was long and winding, the road narrowing the deeper we went into the forest. The trees grew taller, their branches thick and tangled overhead, blocking out most of the daylight. By the time we found the spot, the sun was already setting, casting a deep orange glow over the treetops. We set up camp quickly, pitching the tent, gathering wood for the fire, the usual routine. The air felt fresh, clean, and there was a sense of isolation that was both thrilling and unnerving. No cell signal, no other campers, just us and the wilderness. As night fell, we sat around the fire, laughing, telling stories, roasting marshmallows. It felt perfect. But then, just as we were settling in, Jason paused mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on the trees behind me. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I hadn't heard anything, Mark hadn't either, but Jason insisted he heard something moving in the woods, just out of sight. We listened for a moment, the fire crackling, the woods completely still. Then, faintly, we all heard it, a low shuffling sound like something dragging across the ground. It was coming from somewhere beyond the tree line, out in the thick black woods. It didn't sound like an animal, not any animal I'd ever heard anyway. It was too deliberate, too slow. We sat there silent, straining our ears. But after a few minutes, the sound stopped. Mark chuckled nervously, brushing it off. Probably just a raccoon or something. Jason didn't look convinced, but he shrugged and went along with it. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us. I didn't say anything to the others, not wanting to sound paranoid, but I could tell Jason was on edge too. He kept glancing at the trees, his eyes darting around like he was expecting something to emerge from the darkness. Eventually, we all went to bed, the fire reduced to glowing embers. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to the night, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But sleep didn't come easy. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know what had stirred me, just that something wasn't right. The air inside the tent felt heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth. I could hear Jason and Mark breathing softly beside me, their forms barely visible in the dim light. And then I heard it, that same dragging sound. Closer now, much closer. It was coming from right outside the tent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and ragged. The sound was slow, rhythmic, like something was crawling through the dirt just feet away from where we slept. I didn't dare move, barely even breathed, my mind racing with thoughts of what it could be. I wanted to wake Jason and Mark, but fear held me in place. Then I heard the tent's zipper. It was faint, just the smallest pull, like someone testing it. My blood turned to ice. I strained my ears, listening as the zipper moved again, this time lower, just a few inches. I couldn't stay still anymore. I turned my head slowly toward Jason, but he was still asleep. I reached out to shake him awake when, suddenly, the zipper stopped. For a long moment, everything was silent. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything. And then, just as I was about to move, the dragging sound began again, this time moving away from the tent, back into the woods. I lay there, paralyzed, until the sound faded into the distance. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and sleeplessness. When morning finally came, I crawled out of the tent, exhausted, my body aching from the tension. Jason and Mark were still asleep, completely unaware of what had happened. That's when I saw them, footprints, dozens of them, all around the campsite. Deep, heavy prints in the dirt, circling our tent, leading off into the trees. But they weren't normal footprints. They were long, almost like a person's, but stretched, distorted. And they didn't look fresh either. They looked old, like they'd been there for years, even though the dirt was freshly disturbed. I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind raced with possibilities. A prank, some kind of animal, maybe even a hallucination from lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I woke Jason and Mark, showing them the prints. Jason's face went pale. "That's not right," he muttered, his voice shaky. Mark tried to laugh it off, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. We packed up quickly, none of us wanting to stay any longer. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, just out of sight. The woods felt darker, more oppressive, like they were closing in on us. Every now and then I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. We finally made it back to the car, loaded our gear, and drove out of there as fast as we could. None of us spoke on the drive back, each lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we stopped at a gas station, miles away from the forest, that Jason finally broke the silence. "I saw something," he said, his voice barely audible. Mark and I both turned to him. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "Last night," he continued, staring down at his hands, "when you two were asleep, I heard something moving outside the tent. I thought it was an animal, but then I saw it, this thing. It was crawling through the dirt just outside the firelight. It looked human, but wrong, like it had been stretched out, like its body didn't fit together the way it should." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "It was dragging something behind it. I don't know what. I didn't want to look too close. I was so scared I couldn't move. I thought I was imagining it, but now, after seeing those footprints..." He trailed off, his voice shaking. Mark and I just stared at him, both of us too stunned to speak. We never went back to that forest, never spoke about it again, but I think about it sometimes, about that thing Jason saw, about the prints, about the zipper, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't done with us. We weren't supposed to camp there. I mean, technically it wasn't even on the map, this little clearing deep in the woods way off any official trail. But when my buddy Matt found it during one of his solo hikes, he swore it was the perfect spot for an authentic wilderness experience. So naturally, when he suggested a weekend camping trip, the four of us, me, Matt, his girlfriend Tara, and my brother Luke, agreed. It took us hours to get there, well beyond the usual campsites and hiking paths. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows between the trees. It was beautiful, though. Tall pines all around, the sky a deep orange, and the kind of quiet that you only find far away from civilization. We set up camp quickly. The fire crackled, and the stars began to peek out. We were laughing, passing around snacks, and talking about the usual stuff when Luke pointed something out. "Do you guys notice how quiet it is?" At first I thought he was just talking about the usual peacefulness of the woods, but then I realized what he meant. There were no sounds, no birds, no insects, not even the rustling of leaves in the wind. The fire made its soft crackling noises, and we made small talk, but that was it. The rest of the world was still. "Maybe we're just that far out," Tara said, trying to lighten the mood, but I could see her glancing around like she was expecting something to jump out at her. It wasn't until later, after the fire started to die down and the stars shone bright above us, that things got weird. We were getting ready to turn in for the night when we heard it. Footsteps. Not just one or two, but the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, walking just beyond the circle of light from our fire. We all froze. "Did you hear that?" Matt whispered. None of us answered, but we all heard it, crunching, deliberate footsteps in the dead leaves, pacing around the perimeter of our camp. "Hello?" Luke called out, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees, but nothing moved. The footsteps stopped, just as abruptly as they had started. We waited, listening, our breath catching in our throats. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I broke the silence. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to convince myself more than anyone else. No one really responded. We just sat there staring into the dark, waiting for something else to happen. When it didn't, we decided to head to our tents. Luke and I shared one, while Matt and Tara took the other. I was lying in my sleeping bag staring at the roof of the tent when I heard the footsteps again. This time they were slower, closer, circling around us like something was inspecting the camp. "Luke, you hear that?" I whispered. "Yeah," he muttered back, his voice barely audible. "Maybe it's a deer." The sound of footsteps, human-like footsteps, doesn't sound like a deer. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, moving deliberately, too close for comfort. I didn't sleep much that night, and from the way Luke kept shifting in his sleeping bag, I knew he didn't either. The next morning, when we all gathered around the fire to make breakfast, Matt looked pale. He hadn't slept well either, and Tara seemed even worse. She kept rubbing her arms, saying she felt cold, even though it wasn't that chilly. "I had this weird dream last night," she said, her voice shaky. "I dreamt that something was standing outside the tent, just watching us. I could hear it breathing, but when I tried to look, I couldn't move." Matt glanced at her, then at us. I had the same dream. Luke and I exchanged looks. We hadn't had any dreams, but those footsteps weren't our imaginations. There was something out there last night. After breakfast, we decided to take a walk through the woods, maybe explore the area a bit and shake off the weird vibe from the night before. But as we packed up, Luke froze, his eyes wide, staring at the ground just beyond the fire pit. "Guys, come look at this." We all moved over to where he was standing, and there, pressed into the dirt, were footprints. Bare footprints. Human footprints. They circled the camp in a perfect ring, some overlapping where someone or something had walked back and forth in the night. "No way," I muttered, feeling a cold dread settle in my stomach. "Who the hell would be out here barefoot in the middle of the night?" Tara stepped back, her face pale. "We didn't hear anyone leave. We didn't hear anyone come into camp either." Matt crouched down, inspecting the prints. "These are fresh," he said quietly, "but there's something weird." We all looked closer. The prints weren't just footprints. They were long, too long, like the toes were stretched out unnaturally, the arch of the foot distorted. They weren't human, not exactly. Luke backed away, shaking his head. "Okay, this is messed up. We need to leave." But Matt, ever the stubborn one, didn't want to go. "It's probably some kind of animal. We're just spooking ourselves out." Tara wasn't having it. "Animal? That's not an animal, Matt. That's something else." After a tense argument, we decided to pack up and head back toward the trail. But as we were gathering our gear, the woods fell silent again, completely and unnervingly still. Then came the laughter. It started faint, like a child's giggle, drifting through the trees. Then it grew louder, more distinct, moving from one side of the clearing to the other, echoing all around us. High-pitched, unnatural, like something was mocking us. "Let's go, now," I said, not waiting for anyone to agree. We grabbed our gear and started hiking back toward the trail, the eerie laughter following us, growing fainter and fainter but never completely fading. We didn't stop, didn't speak, just walked as fast as we could until we finally reached the trailhead hours later, our legs burning and our nerves shot. As we piled into the car, I glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see something standing at the edge, watching us leave. But there was nothing. Just the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. None of us spoke much on the drive home. We didn't know how to explain what had happened, and to be honest, I'm not sure I want to. But here's the thing that still gives me chills. When we got back and started unpacking the car, Tara found something in her backpack, a small carved wooden figure, shaped like a person. It wasn't there when we packed up that morning, and none of us had seen it before. But it was there, tucked into the side pocket of her bag. And when we looked closely, we saw that its face was smiling. It started out as the perfect trip. Just me and my two friends, Mike and Sarah, camping deep in the remote wilderness, far from the noise and bustle of city life. We'd been planning this weekend getaway for months, eager to disconnect and unwind under the stars. We found the perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines right next to a crystal-clear lake. No other campers for miles. It was exactly what we were looking for. The first day went off without a hitch. We set up our tents, gathered wood for the fire, and spent the evening swapping stories as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The night was calm, the sky bursting with stars, and the only sound was the soft lapping of the lake against the shore. For a moment it felt like we were the only people on Earth. But as the fire burned down to embers and we started to drift off to sleep, I heard it. A voice. It was distant, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, but unmistakable. A single word that sent a shiver down my spine. Help. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening intently. At first, I thought it was Mike or Sarah playing a prank, but when I looked over, both were fast asleep in their tents. The fire crackled softly, casting weak light over the campsite, but everything else was silent. The trees stood still, the lake was calm, and there was no wind. I convinced myself I must have been hearing things, maybe a distant echo of the forest or some animal call that my mind misinterpreted. I forced myself to lay back down, closing my eyes, though sleep didn't come easily. The next day I didn't mention it to Mike or Sarah. No point in freaking them out, right? We spent the day hiking, exploring the woods, and even went for a swim in the lake. The strange moment from the night before faded into the background, replaced by laughter and the thrill of being disconnected from everything. But that night, the voice came back. It started just as I was dozing off. That same soft, eerie whisper, barely audible but impossible to ignore. This time it was clearer, closer. Help! Me! I shot up, my heart racing. I wasn't imagining it this time. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The campfire had died out completely, leaving only faint embers glowing in the dark. Mike and Sarah were still asleep. Everything around me was still and quiet. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the towering pines and casting long, twisted shadows across the ground, but there was nothing. No movement, no signs of life. Then the voice came again. Help. Me. Please. It was coming from the lake. I turned slowly, shining the flashlight toward the water. The lake was perfectly still, its surface like glass, reflecting the stars above. But in the distance, right near the center of the lake, I saw something, just barely, a dark figure standing in the water. My heart skipped a beat. It looked like a person, just standing there, half submerged, motionless. Mike, Sarah, I shouted, backing away from the lake, my voice shaking. They scrambled out of their tents, groggy and confused. What is it? Mike asked, rubbing his eyes. I pointed toward the lake, my hand trembling. There's someone out there. They both turned and looked. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and aimed it toward the water, but by the time the beam hit the lake, the figure was gone. The water was still again, as if nothing had ever been there. Are you sure? Sarah asked, her voice skeptical but uneasy. I saw something, I muttered, unsure of my own words now. And I heard someone asking for help. Mike shook his head. We're in the middle of nowhere, man. There's no one out here but us. I know what I heard, I insisted, but the doubt in my voice was obvious. We stayed up for another hour, circling the camp with our flashlights, but there was nothing. No tracks, no signs of anyone near the lake. Eventually, we gave up, figuring it must have been my mind playing tricks on me, a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The third night was when everything fell apart. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound I'll never forget. the distinct, slow, dragging sound of something being pulled across the ground. It was close, way too close to our camp. I froze, every muscle tensing as I strained to listen. The dragging stopped, followed by the unmistakable sound of breathing, slow, raspy breaths, right outside my tent. I held my breath, terrified that whatever it was would hear me. Then the voice, "Help me!" But this time it wasn't a distant whisper. It was right outside my tent, low and guttural, as if someone, or something, was crouched just on the other side of the fabric, begging to be let in. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the zipper of my tent and yanked it open, ready to confront whatever nightmare was haunting me. But there was no one there, just darkness and silence. "Mike! Sarah!" I shouted again, scrambling out of my tent. They burst out of their tents, panicked and confused. "What's going on?" Mike asked, flashlight in hand. I tried to explain, but the words got caught in my throat. That's when we all heard it. The voice, clear as day this time, coming from the trees. "Help me." We all turned at once, shining our flashlights toward the source of the sound. There, standing just at the edge of the forest, was a figure. A woman, her clothes tattered and soaked, her face pale, almost glowing in the dark. Her eyes were wide, hollow, and locked onto ours. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice so broken it barely sounded human. We stood frozen, too terrified to move as she stepped forward. Her feet didn't touch the ground. She hovered just above the earth, moving toward us slowly, her arms outstretched. That was it. We bolted. We grabbed whatever we could and ran, leaving the camp, our gear, everything behind. I didn't look back until we reached the trailhead, and even then I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still following us, her hollow eyes watching, waiting. We made it back to civilization by morning, exhausted and shaken. None of us spoke about what we saw, but we didn't need to. We all knew what we had heard, what we had seen. I don't go camping anymore. I can't, because sometimes, when the night is quiet and the world is still, I can still hear that voice, faint but clear, calling from deep in the woods. "Help me." There were 4 of us, me, Ben, Sarah, and Nick. We were old college friends looking for a getaway, somewhere remote, quiet, where we could unplug from the stress of our lives. Nick found the place online, a secluded cabin deep in the woods, sitting right by the edge of a lake. The pictures made it look perfect, too perfect maybe. The drive out took hours, far from any town, and as we turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt trail, I remember thinking how cut off we really were. No cell service, no people. Just an endless stretch of towering pines and a suffocating sense of isolation. But we weren't worried then. If anything, it felt like a relief. The cabin was even more remote than I expected. The trees crowded in on all sides, making the place feel smaller than it was. The lake, though, God, the lake was beautiful. Still, glassy, and reflecting the sky in a way that seemed almost too serene. Something about that stillness felt unnatural, like the lake was holding its breath. But Ben was already unpacking, and Sarah and Nick were laughing, so I pushed the feeling aside. That first night everything seemed normal. We built a fire outside, roasted marshmallows, told dumb stories from college. The moon was high, casting a silver sheen across the water. There was no noise except for the occasional crackle of the fire and the soft lap of the lake against the shore. At some point, Sarah asked, "Do you think anyone's ever drowned in this lake?" The question hung in the air, heavy. Nick laughed it off, calling her morbid, but I could tell the thought unsettled the group. Something about the lake had that effect. Its perfect stillness, the way it seemed to absorb sound. Ben broke the tension by cracking open another beer, but none of us quite shook the unease. Later we headed inside, the fire dwindling to embers. It wasn't until I lay in bed, the darkness pressing in around me, that I heard it. A soft rhythmic sound, like someone walking around the cabin, their footsteps crunching against the gravel. I sat up, listening, waiting for one of the others to call out, to acknowledge they'd heard it too. But there was only silence. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. The woods were full of things that move in the night, right? Still, I couldn't sleep after that, my eyes fixed on the sliver of moonlight slipping through the window, my ears straining for any more sounds. The next morning, I was the first one up. I stepped outside, breathing in the cool air, trying to shake off the weird feeling from the night before. That's when I noticed the footprints, dozens of them, circling the cabin in the dirt. Bare footprints. My stomach turned. "Ben!" I yelled, calling him out. He came out of the cabin yawning and rubbing his eyes. When I showed him the prints, his face went pale. "That's strange," he muttered, kneeling down to examine them. "They look fresh."
No.
We spent the morning trying to figure out where they came from. They led toward the lake, but there was no sign of anyone else around. The trail just stopped, vanished. Sarah suggested it was some local prankster, but something about the depth of those prints unnerved me. Whoever or whatever had made them had been standing right outside our windows. The second night was worse. It started with the tapping, light at first, just a few knocks against the cabin walls. Then more, like a steady rhythm echoing from outside. It was coming from all sides, like something or someone was circling the cabin again, tapping as they went. "Is someone out there?" Nick asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. We were all frozen, listening. Then came the laughter. It was distant, soft, but unmistakable. A child's laugh floating across the lake. It sent a chill down my spine, and when I looked at the others, their faces were drained of color. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice shaky. We all agreed. Whatever was happening wasn't normal. The place felt wrong, like the forest itself was watching us, and the lake, its surface was so unnaturally smooth, like glass. Not even the wind could disturb it. It was as if the water itself was hiding something. We packed in a frenzy, desperate to get out, but when we reached the car, Ben stopped dead in his tracks. The tires, they were flat, not just flat, but slashed, deep cuts in the rubber. Someone, or something, didn't want us leaving. Panic set in. We were trapped. No phone service, no way to drive out, and a long, long walk back to civilization. Ben and Nick tried to patch the tires, but we all knew it wasn't going to work. We were stuck for the night, whether we liked it or not. That evening, the lake seemed to glow under the moonlight, a pale, ghostly shimmer that felt wrong. We barricaded ourselves inside the cabin, pushing furniture against the doors, hoping it would be enough. Then, just after midnight, the whispering started, low, unintelligible murmurs, like a conversation just out of earshot. I pressed my ear to the wall, heart pounding. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were coming from beneath the cabin. I froze, and so did everyone else. We looked at each other, our fear mirrored in each other's faces. "Is there a basement?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. We hadn't even considered that. Ben, flashlight in hand, found the hatch in the corner of the cabin, hidden beneath a rug, a trap door sealed shut with heavy bolts. I don't know why, but I felt a deep, primal terror at the thought of opening it. Nick, ever the brave one, undid the bolts one by one. The hatch creaked open, releasing a gust of damp, moldy air. The whispers grew louder, clearer. And then the laughter returned. That same eerie, childlike giggle, now unmistakably coming from below. "Close it," I urged, but it was too late. Nick shone his flashlight down into the darkness, and we all saw it at once. A staircase leading down into the earth, and at the bottom, figures, pale, with wide black eyes staring back up at us. They were grinning, their mouths too wide, too full of teeth. We slammed the hatch shut, but it didn't matter. The whispering didn't stop. That was last night, the car still unusable. The forest feels closer now, like it's tightening around the cabin, and the lake, it's not still anymore. The water's churning like something underneath is waking up. I don't know if we'll make it out, but if you're hearing this, if someone finds this recording, "Don't come here. Don't come to the cabin by the lake, because once you do, you won't leave." I've always loved the idea of camping in the wild, being out there away from everything where you can breathe and just exist. That's what made me jump at the chance when my friend Marcus suggested a weekend trip deep in the Smoky Mountains. It was the perfect escape, or so I thought. We left early on a Friday, 4 of us crammed into Marcus's SUV, loaded with gear and high spirits. Along with Marcus, there was Jess, who always had the best ghost stories, and Ethan, our comic relief, the guy who could turn any tense situation into a joke. And then there was me, just hoping for some peace and quiet away from the buzz of life. The drive up the mountain took longer than expected. Roads twisted and turned, narrowing into rough, unmarked trails. The further we got, the fewer signs of civilization there were. Cell signals faded into nothing, and soon it was just us surrounded by endless stretches of dense trees, tall and dark like silent sentinels. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun was starting to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally over the forest floor. The campsite itself was nothing more than a small clearing, barely big enough for our 2 tents. It was hemmed in by a thick wall of trees that felt too close. The air was cooler here, the kind that presses against your skin like a warning, but Marcus was unfazed. "This is the spot," he said, grinning. "No one will find us here." We set up camp as the last of the light disappeared. Jess and I gathered firewood while Marcus and Ethan wrestled with the tents. The quiet was unnerving. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. A silence so deep it swallowed everything. That night around the fire, the mood shifted. The usual banter was subdued. The crackling of the flames sounded louder than it should have, each snap echoing through the trees like it was the only sound for miles. Jess broke the silence, her voice low, almost hesitant. "Do you guys feel like we're being watched?" Ethan snorted. Classic Jess, can't resist creeping us out. But no one laughed. Even Marcus's smile faltered. "I'm serious," she continued, staring into the dark woods just beyond the glow of the fire. "There's something out there." I followed her gaze, but all I saw were trees, endless and impenetrable. But the more I stared, the more wrong they seemed. Their shapes didn't line up. Branches seemed to shift. Shadows flickered where there was no light. I felt a cold dread slither down my spine, something primal whispering that we weren't alone. The first incident happened that night. I woke up to the sound of rustling, soft at first, like something dragging through the underbrush. I lay still, my ears straining to hear. Then it grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't the wind, I was sure of that. I nudged Marcus, who was snoring beside me in the tent. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He grunted, but didn't wake. The noise outside was getting closer. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, peeking out into the darkness. The fire had long since died, leaving everything pitch black. But the sound, it was right there, just beyond the trees. Something big was moving. My heart raced. Then, silence. I stared into the black void, half expecting something to leap out at me, but there was nothing. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, my skin prickling, waiting for the sound to return. It never did. The next morning, Ethan was gone. At first, we thought he was just messing with us, typical Ethan, we figured, but after an hour of calling his name, trekking through the woods, we realized something was very, very wrong. His backpack was still there, his boots too. He wouldn't have gone far without them. "Maybe he's playing some kind of prank," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. His eyes kept darting to the trees. By noon, panic had set in. Jess was near tears, pacing around the campsite, her eyes wide, darting around like she expected Ethan to jump out at any moment. But I knew better. Something had happened. The woods felt different. The air was heavier, almost suffocating, like we were trespassers in a place we didn't belong. And whatever owned this place, it didn't want us here. By dusk, we heard it again. The same rustling, circling us, moving through the underbrush. But this time it was faster, more agitated. I could see Marcus gripping his knife, his knuckles white. Jess refused to leave the fire, her face pale and drawn. Then, out of nowhere, Marcus stood up. "We have to find him," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't just—" He never finished his sentence. A blur shot out from the trees, something dark and impossibly fast, and Marcus was gone. One moment he was there, and the next the spot where he'd stood was empty, save for the knife he'd dropped. We didn't sleep that night. Jess and I sat with our backs to the fire, gripping the hatchet, our eyes scanning the woods, every crack of a branch sending us into a panic. But nothing came. Nothing except that creeping sense that something was watching, waiting. Morning came, but it didn't bring safety. Jess was the next to vanish. One minute she was gathering wood for the fire, and the next her scream tore through the forest. I ran toward the sound, but when I got there, the ground was disturbed, her footprints trailing into the trees, and then nothing. Just silence. I was alone. That was when I noticed something I hadn't before. There were no signs of struggle, no broken branches or disturbed leaves. It was as if Jess had simply walked into the forest and disappeared. Like Marcus. Like Ethan. That's when it hit me. I knew this place. It wasn't the first time I'd been here. Memories came flooding back, fragmented and buried deep. I had been here before, years ago, and the people with me then, they'd vanished too. Just like this. Because they weren't taken by something in the woods. They were taken by the woods. I'm not sure why I'm the one who always survives, why the woods let me go when they take the others. But it happens every time. I lure them here, unknowingly, until they're swallowed up, and I'm left alone, waiting for the next group of friends who want to escape into the wilderness. Because this place, it's not just alive, it's hungry, and now I'm already thinking about who I can bring next. When my brother Chris suggested a weekend camping trip to Dry Creek Woods, I thought it was the perfect escape. 2 days of hiking, stargazing, and getting away from the noise of the city sounded like exactly what I needed. I hadn't seen Chris in months, and we'd always bonded over these little adventures. But what we encountered in those woods wasn't the peaceful, back-to-nature getaway we were expecting. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun hanging low and casting an orange glow over the trees as we set up camp. Dry Creek was isolated, more isolated than I realized, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen such an untouched forest. It was beautiful, in a way that makes you forget the world beyond those trees even exists. There was no cell service, no sounds of cars, just pure, perfect silence. We found a clearing near the creek itself, just a small trickle of water winding through the forest floor. We pitched our tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and settled down to cook dinner as the sun dipped beneath the horizon. Everything was peaceful, that kind of deep, unnerving peace that you only find in a place far from civilization, where the world seems to hold its breath. It wasn't until the sky turned black and the stars came out that I noticed the path, a narrow, overgrown trail leading from the edge of our campsite deeper into the woods. I hadn't noticed it when we set up camp, and it seemed to wind off into the trees, disappearing around a bend. "Hey, Chris," I said, gesturing toward the path, "you think that's a hiking trail or something?" He looked up from the fire, squinting toward the shadows where the path began. "Weird. I didn't see that earlier." He shrugged. "Maybe it's an animal trail. This place hasn't been used in years, you know." We didn't think much of it, at least not then. The path just seemed like one of those odd features you notice when you're out in nature, forgotten, mysterious, but nothing to worry about. The rest of the night was uneventful. We talked, drank, and eventually the warmth of the fire lulled us to sleep. I woke up suddenly, and I didn't know why. The fire had died down to embers, and the forest was pitch black around us. I checked my watch. It was 3:14 a.m. Chris was snoring softly beside me, wrapped tight in his sleeping bag. It was then that I heard it, a soft, crunching sound like footsteps on dry leaves coming from the direction of the path. I sat up, listening hard. They were slow, deliberate steps, not like an animal, but like a person, taking care to step lightly, trying not to be heard. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding, and pointed it toward the path, half expecting to see a hiker or a ranger or something. But the beam only illuminated the trees and that empty, narrow trail leading into the woods. The footsteps stopped the moment the light hit, and there was nothing, just the stillness of the night. I turned the flashlight off and sat in silence for a long while, straining to hear anything, but the footsteps didn't return. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing, or maybe just a deer, and I went back to sleep. The next morning, I asked Chris about it. He laughed, dismissing it as forest paranoia, a term we used for those times when your mind starts playing tricks on you in the wilderness. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been watching us. We decided to explore the creek that day, but by mid-afternoon, curiosity got the better of us, and we headed down the mysterious path. It was barely wide enough for one person and looked like it hadn't been walked in years. Thorny vines clawed at our ankles and thick tree branches twisted overhead, blocking out the sky. Chris walked ahead, pushing branches aside, and I followed close behind. The deeper we went, the more unsettling the forest became. It felt wrong. It was like the air itself grew heavier with every step, and the sounds of the forest, the birds, the rustling leaves, seemed to fade away the farther we went. After about half an hour of walking, we found something that made us both stop in our tracks. A clearing, but not like the one we camped in. This one was unnaturally perfect, like someone had cleared the land deliberately. In the center stood a single large tree, its branches bare despite the season, and carved into the bark were symbols, strange jagged markings I'd never seen before. They were crude, almost childlike, but they carried an unsettling energy. "What do you think this is?" I asked, running my fingers over the carvings. They felt smooth, almost polished, as if they'd been cut recently. Chris didn't answer. He was staring at the ground, pale-faced, and when I followed his gaze, I saw it too. Footprints, bare footprints, leading in and out of the clearing from multiple directions. And they were fresh. "We should go," Chris said, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't argue. We retraced our steps, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched, of eyes following our every movement from the shadows. But as we hurried back to camp, something felt off. The trail seemed different, like it was winding in directions it hadn't before. I tried to keep calm, but my sense of direction told me we were heading the wrong way, deeper into the woods rather than out. And that's when we found it, our campsite. We stumbled upon it, nearly tripping over the fire pit in relief. But something was very wrong. It was the same clearing, the same tent, the same creek. But everything was reversed. The tent faced the wrong direction. Our gear was scattered about in a way we hadn't left it, and even the trees seemed to twist in opposite directions. It was like a mirror image of our camp, familiar, but all wrong. "What the hell is this?" I whispered, my voice cracking. Chris didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at the tent. The flap was half open, and inside was a figure. At first I thought it was a person crouching, but then it turned, and I saw its face. It was me, or something like me. The face was mine, but stretched, distorted, the eyes too big, the mouth too wide, and the skin a sickly pale color that almost glowed in the fading light. It stared at us, smiling that too wide smile, its head tilted unnaturally to the side as if amused by our fear. We ran. I don't know how far or how long we ran, but we didn't stop until we burst through the tree line and stumbled onto a trail, an actual trail, well-worn and marked. We kept running until we reached the main road, where we finally collapsed in exhaustion. When we got back to town, we told the police what we saw, but they didn't believe us. They said we were lucky to have found our way out and that we'd probably just gotten lost, our minds playing tricks on us, but I know what we saw. I know what was in that tent. Chris refuses to talk about it. He hasn't spoken to me since that night. And sometimes I can't sleep. I see that face, the too wide smile, the hollow eyes, and I hear those footsteps slowly crunching through the leaves just outside my window. And the worst part is, last night I heard something new, not footsteps, not laughter, but a voice. My voice calling softly from the woods, "Come back, you forgot something." We'd been planning the trip for months, a weekend getaway deep in the woods, far from the crowds and the noise of our regular lives. There were 5 of us, me, my girlfriend Emma, and our friends Jason, Lily, and Tom. The goal was simple: hike in, set up camp, drink some beers, tell stories, and disconnect from the world. We found the perfect spot, an isolated clearing near an old, overgrown trail. It was beautiful and untouched, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to swallow the sky. The air was crisp, clean, and filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Everything was perfect. That first day was normal. We spent the evening setting up our tents, gathering firewood, and cooking over the campfire. As the sun set, the woods transformed. The shadows stretched long and deep, and the temperature dropped quickly. Still, the fire was warm, and the laughter between us was enough to stave off the chill. Around midnight, after a few beers and stories, Tom leaned forward, his face half illuminated by the fire's glow. "You guys heard about this place, right?" he asked, his voice low and conspiratorial. Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "Here we go, another one of Tom's local legends." But Tom's expression didn't break. "No, seriously, this forest used to be part of some old logging town back in the early 1900s. The town's long gone now, but people say weird things happen around here. People have disappeared, they never found bodies, just gone." Emma rolled her eyes. "Every forest has a people disappearing story." Tom shrugged, clearly enjoying himself. "Maybe, but they say something still walks in these woods. Something that can make you forget." There was a moment of silence before Lily burst out laughing. "I'm sorry, Tom, but that's ridiculous." The conversation moved on, but the eerie tone lingered. Eventually, one by one, we all turned in for the night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the forest settled into its nighttime rhythm. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the soft crackle of dying flames. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Sometime during the night I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first, maybe a sound or a change in the air, but something felt wrong. The tent was stuffy, and the darkness felt thick, oppressive. Emma was asleep beside me, her breathing steady. I listened. The crickets were gone. The forest had gone silent, as if holding its breath. I held mine too, straining to hear anything at all. Then, faintly, a whisper, soft, barely audible, like wind through leaves, but it wasn't the wind. I could hear words, though I couldn't make them out. They were wrong, distorted somehow. I slowly unzipped the tent and peered out. The fire was out, nothing but cold ashes and smoke. The trees loomed like shadows against the night sky. And there, just at the edge of the clearing, I saw something, a figure. At first I thought it was one of the others, maybe Tom or Jason, but this figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there, at the edge of the darkness, as if waiting for something. My heart thudded in my chest, and I blinked, trying to clear my vision. The figure didn't move, but I had the growing, horrible sensation that it was staring right at me. I whispered Emma's name, but she didn't wake up. I whispered louder, shaking her shoulder. Still nothing. I glanced back at the figure. It was gone. I froze. My heart pounded in my ears. I scanned the edge of the clearing, but it was empty. The whispering had stopped too. The silence was deafening. Telling myself it had just been a trick of the light, I lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag up to my chin. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually, exhaustion overtook me. The next morning I didn't mention what I'd seen. Maybe it was a dream. That's what I told myself. But Tom was acting strange. He was usually the first one up, eager to make breakfast or start packing for the day. But this morning he sat by the dead fire, staring at the ashes, barely acknowledging anyone. "Hey, you all right?" Jason asked, slapping Tom on the back. Tom blinked as if he hadn't heard the question. He muttered something about a rough night and shook it off, but I could tell something had rattled him. The hike that day felt off. The woods were darker than they had been before, even though the sun was out. The trees felt too close, the air too still, and every so often I thought I caught glimpses of something moving just out of sight, flitting between the trunks, but whenever I turned, there was nothing. Then, late in the afternoon, we came across something that stopped us all cold. A cabin. It shouldn't have been there. There were no markings on the map, no trails leading to it. The wood was rotting. The roof partially collapsed, but it was unmistakable, a relic from the logging town Tom had mentioned the night before. No one spoke. We just stared. Finally, Tom broke the silence. "We should check it out." "No way," Emma said immediately, shaking her head. "This place gives me the creeps." But Tom was already walking toward it, his face set in that stubborn way of his. Jason and Lily followed, reluctant but curious. Emma and I exchanged a glance before we trailed behind them. The door was ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. Inside, it was exactly what you'd expect from an abandoned cabin: dust, broken furniture, and the stench of mold. But there was something else, too. A feeling, like the air was heavier, thicker, as if we had walked into something ancient. Something that didn't want us there. Tom stepped inside first, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. The rest of us stayed near the entrance, watching him carefully. He turned toward a wall where something was scratched into the wood. I saw his eyes narrow, trying to make sense of it. "What is it?" Jason asked, stepping closer. Tom didn't answer. He just kept staring, his mouth slightly open, his eyes unfocused. I moved closer, squinting at the marks. They weren't random scratches. They were words, carved deep into the wood in jagged, uneven lines. I read them aloud, my voice barely a whisper. "Do not forget." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Do not forget. What did that mean? And then, as if on cue, Tom slowly turned toward us, his face pale and blank. His lips moved, and when he spoke, it was barely audible. "I don't remember." My blood ran cold. "What?" Tom blinked, his face twisting in confusion. "Where are we?" "Tom, we're camping, man," Jason said, his voice rising in concern. But Tom only looked more confused. He stepped back from the wall, his eyes darting around the cabin like he was seeing it for the first time. "I don't remember this place," he whispered. "How did we get here?" The air in the cabin felt suffocating now. I grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her toward the door. "We need to go." As we hurried out, I glanced back at Tom. He was still standing there, staring at the scratched words, a lost expression on his face. That night, as we sat around the campfire, Tom didn't say a word. He just stared into the flames, a hollow look in his eyes. And I couldn't help but wonder, what had Tom forgotten? And more terrifyingly, what might we all forget before the weekend was over?